Before the concept of time had even begun to carve its linear path, and long before the agonizing weight of history settled upon the crumbling foundations of the world, there existed only a profound, unending stillness. This was the primordial epoch, a vast and unformed era remembered in the hushed, fearful whispers of scholars as the Age of Ancients. To gaze into the annals of this primordial time is to look into a mirror reflecting nothing but utter emptiness. The universe in this forgotten age was completely unformed, lacking any of the fundamental laws or defining characteristics that would later govern existence. It was a realm submerged in a dense, suffocating gray fog that rolled endlessly across the void. This fog was not merely a weather phenomenon. It was a metaphysical shroud, a heavy, oppressive blanket that smothered all possibility and choked the very concept of beginning. Within this suffocating mist, there was no concept of disparity. The world was entirely devoid of the binary opposites that would eventually tear it apart. There was no radiant light to illuminate the heavens, nor was there an enveloping dark to conceal the horrors of the earth. There was no blistering heat to provide comfort or destruction, and there was no biting cold to freeze the breath in one's lungs. Most crucially, in this silent epoch, there was no life, and because there was no biological life, there could be no true death. Everything simply existed in a state of absolute, unchanging equilibrium. It was a cosmic pause, a permanent twilight of existence where nothing could ever grow and nothing could ever decay. The physical geography of this era was as bleak and unforgiving as its metaphysical laws. When the dense gray fog occasioned, it revealed a dead, jagged landscape composed entirely of colossal, monolithic gray crags. These crags jutted outward into the infinite emptiness, offering no soil for growth and no comfort for the weary. The architecture of the Age of Ancients was inherently terrifyingly vertical. The crags implied a sheer, dizzying plunge into an abyssal void below, bordered at its deepest, most foundational levels by the endless, stagnant, and dark waters of a subterranean lake. Rising from these impossibly deep, silent waters were the arch trees. These were not trees of wood and sap, but towering, colossal pillars of an ancient, petrified world. Their sheer scale was unfathomable, their trunks so massive they appeared to hold up the very fabric of the gray sky above. The arch trees stood as silent sentinels in the mist, their vast canopies lost in the suffocating fog, their roots plunging deep into the lightless, watery abyss. The landscape was a monument to stagnation, an unyielding canvas of stone, water, and mist that had never known the gentle touch of the wind or the destructive force of a storm. The sole denizens and absolute rulers of this silent, unchanging epoch were beings of terrifying majesty and unknowable nature. High above the endless crags and nestled within the highest reaches of the towering arch trees dwelt the everlasting dragons. To call them living creatures would be a fundamental misunderstanding of their nature. They were not biological organisms in any conventional sense. They possessed no beating hearts, they drew no breath, and they felt no hunger. Rather, they were transcendent, pseudo-mineral life forms that existed entirely outside the parameters of time, biology, and mortality. Their legendary immortality was intrinsically tied to the very essence of their physical forms, specifically their magnificent stone scales. These scales, forged from the same unchanging minerals as the gray crags they perched upon rendered the dragons utterly impervious to physical decay, elemental alteration, or the passage of ages. Because the universe fundamentally lacked the concept of disparity, there were no forces capable of challenging their stone flesh. Nothing could change their forms, nothing could harm them, and therefore nothing could ever kill them. The everlasting dragons simply existed, eternal and unchanging, in a state of permanent gray stillness. They were the physical embodiment of the age of ancients. They did not wage war, for there was nothing to conquer. They did not build, for there was nothing to create. They did not reproduce, for there was no need to replenish ranks that could never be depleted. They were the silent, majestic apex of a world that was permanently frozen in a single, unending moment. To stand in their presence would be to feel the crushing weight of eternity, a humbling, terrifying realization of one's own insignificance before beings that had always been, and seemingly always will. Imagine, if you will, the absolute sensory deprivation of this primordial world. The suffocating gray fog was so dense, so all-encompassing, that it offered no horizon, no distant landmarks to guide the eye or offer hope of a destination. It was a tangible presence, a heavy moisture that clung to the stone and absorbed all sound. If one were to scream into the void of the age of ancients, the sound would simply vanish, swallowed whole by the oppressive mist, without so much a faint echo bouncing off the gray crags. The absolute silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums and drives the isolated mind to the very brink of madness. The everlasting dragons, in their terrifying perfection, were completely unbothered by this maddening emptiness. Their existence was one of supreme apathy. They observed that endless gray, not with eyes of flesh, but with the cold, unfeeling perception of the stone they were carved from. They were beautiful, terrible monuments to a universe without purpose. Their massive wings, which could cast shadows over entire landscapes had there been any light to cast them, remained folded. Their immense, jagged jaws remained closed. They were the undisputed masters of nothingness. They required no sustenance, felt no desire, and harbored no ambitions. Their reign was not one of tyranny, but of absolute and chilling indifference. Consider the colossal arch trees. These were the true foundations of the primordial epic. Their bark was like hardened iron, their branches sweeping arcs of petrified wood that seemingly vanished into the heavens. They were the only structures in a world without architects. The roots of these magnificent pillars burrowed down through the gray crags, spiraling endlessly into the dark, subterranean depths. They were the ancient veins of an unliving world, drawing up nothing but the cold, stagnant water of the deep lake. The sheer immensity of these trees suggests a time scale that defies human comprehension. To grow to such staggering heights in a world completely devoid of the life-giving warmth of a sun implies an existence that stretches back through infinite ages, an eternal progression of unrecorded moments stacking upon one another in the dark. Yet even in this era of absolute perfection and unyielding stasis, there were hints of something else, something hidden away in the darkest, most inaccessible corners of the world. Far below the majestic roosts of the everlasting dragons, deep within the tangled, rotten roots of the arch trees and submerged within the abyssal, stagnant waters, other entities existed in quiet obscurity. These were the primordial serpents, imperfect, formless beings biding their time in the dark void. They were patient, silent observers, serving ancient forgotten lords and waiting in the deepest shadows of the world. Their presence in the dark implied a latent potential, a coiled spring waiting for a catalyst that could shatter the eternal silence. The Age of Ancients was a period of perfect, unchanging silence, a cosmic pause that stretched across uncountable, unrecorded millennia. It was a world that did not know suffering, for it did not know joy. It did not know loss, for it did not know possession. It was a beautiful, terrifying void. But this eternal equilibrium was a fragile thing, a temporary suspension of reality destined to be violently, catastrophically shattered by an anomaly that would rewrite the very fabric of existence and introduce the crushing burden of history to a previously innocent universe. The fog was heavy, the crags were sharp, and the dragons were eternal, but deep beneath the earth, an impossible power was waiting to be discovered, a spark that would eventually ignite the greatest tragedy the cosmos had ever known. Before we journey further into the dark, let us linger by the flames for just a moment. Welcome to my fire, traveler. The hollows are wailing tonight across the ruins, and the shadows grow impossibly long. Tell me, how was your day out there in the waking world? Was it good? Was it bad? No matter what it is, you deserve a good night's sleep. If resting by this fire brings you comfort, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Consider it a small offering of souls to keep this bonfire kindled against the encroaching abyss. Now close your eyes, let the crackle of the flames soothe you, and gather your resolve, for the true nightmare of our history is about to unfold. Deep beneath the petrified roots of the colossal arch trees, buried in a subterranean blackness so absolute it defied the very concept of sight, the silent era met its cataclysmic end. This was a depth far removed from the gray crags and the majestic perches of the eternal dragons. It was a lightless, suffocating abyss, a space of pure, unadulterated nothingness where even the heavy fog of the surface could not reach. For uncountable, unrecorded millennia, the subterranean void remained completely undisturbed, existing in a state of perfect, freezing equilibrium. But the cosmos could not tolerate this infinite emptiness forever. The ignition did not begin with a deafening roar, but with a sudden, impossible vibration in the dark. It was a spontaneous anomaly, a localized tearing of the metaphysical fabric that held the primordial world in stasis. Then, deep within the deepest cavern of the earth, a single spark caught. The first flame ignited. It was a blinding, incandescent eruption of color in a universe that had only ever known gray. The fire was chaotic, brilliant, and terrifyingly alive. It danced and roared, casting frantic, flickering shadows against the ancient, unformed stone walls. The crackle of the burning flame was a violent, beautiful symphony, the very first sound to truly echo across the silent, subterranean world. The birth of the first flame was much more than a mere physical fire. It was the genesis of a fundamental cosmological law. It brought forth the absolute concept of disparity, forever shattering the uniform perfection of the Age of Ancients. By casting a brilliant, warm light, the flame simultaneously created the concept of blinding, terrifying dark. By radiating, blistering, comforting heat, it suddenly defined the surrounding void by its piercing, agonizing cold. The perfect stillness of the world was violently replaced by motion, energy, and consumption. And most tragically, with the introduction of this vibrant, burning energy came the conceptual reality of life, and inevitably, the crushing certainty of death. The gray stasis was cleaved forever into binary opposites, contradictory forces that would begin an endless, agonizing struggle for dominance over the fate of the world. From the cold, forgotten recesses of this deep earth, drawn by the sudden, terrifying vibration of heat and the blinding allure of the light, figures began to slowly stir. They emerged from the sludge and the mud of the dark, primitive, and wretched things. These beings were completely hollow vessels, fragile, mindless, and entirely directionless. They possessed no language to voice their confusion, no memories to mourn their past, and no inherent purpose to guide their future. They were the primordial ancestors of consciousness, shuffling blindly through the dark, their gray, gaunt bodies shivering in the newly introduced cold. Yet, they felt the magnetic pull of the fire. Like desperate, unthinking moths drawn to an unfathomable, divine beacon, they dragged their frail, empty forms across the jagged stones, crawling toward the incandescent glow of the first flame. The journey toward the roaring inferno was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage of instinct. Dozens of these hollow figures gathered around the towering bonfire, their empty, eyeless faces bathed in the golden, shifting light. They stared into the heart of the roaring inferno, mesmerized by the sheer power of disparity. Within the dancing, blinding embers, they perceived concentrations of pure, foundational, cosmic energy. These were the Lord's souls, immaculate fragments of the newly born reality, pulsating with the raw power of godhood. One figure, taller and bolder than the rest of the wretched hollows, stepped forward to the very edge of the blazing fire. Without hesitation, this figure reached his gray, trembling hand directly into the blinding, searing heart of the inferno. His fingers closed tightly around the brightest, most radiant ember of them all. He claimed the soul of light. The transformation was magnificent. The blinding energy of the first flame surged through his hollow veins, violently rewriting his very anatomy. The gray flesh was burned away, replaced by a physical form of immense, imposing majesty and divine strength. He ascended to become Lord Gwyn. His raiment manifested as if woven from the golden rays of the sun itself, a regal crown adorning his brow. Unfathomable power cascaded from his very being in the form of brilliant, crackling lightning. The scent of ozone and scorched air filled the cavern as Gwyn lifted his hand, casting a terrifying, localized daytime into the deep earth. He was the Lord of sunlight, the physical embodiment of order, illumination, and raw, radiant power. Beside him, another figure stepped toward the untamed, roaring heat of the fire. Cloaked in ragged, charred shrouds, she did not flinch from the blistering temperature. She extended her hands toward the tempestuous center of the blaze and claimed the soul of life. This was not the gentle, comforting warmth of a hearth. It was the raging, chaotic essence of biological creation and destruction. She ascended to become the Witch of Izalith. The soul infused her form with a catastrophic, burning vitality. She became the mother of fire sorcery, possessing the power to weave continent-spanning firestorms with a mere flick of her wrist. The chaotic, burning essence of life danced at her fingertips, a roaring, passionate heat that animated the living and promised to scorch the unyielding earth to ash. She stood beside Gwyn, a beacon of terrifying heat and uncontrollable elemental fury. From the darkest, most obscure edge of the firelight, a third figure dragged itself forward. It did not reach for the blinding light, nor did it seek the roaring heat. Instead, this terrifying amalgamation of instinct plunged its rotting grasp into the cold, suffocating ash and decaying matter settling at the very base of the first flame. This entity claimed the soul of death. It ascended to become Grave Lord Nitu, the first of the dead. His ascension was a grotesque, morbid symphony of necrosis. He did not become a creature of radiant flesh. Rather, his form ballooned into a colossal, towering amalgamation of skeletal remains and rotting bone, fused together by a dense, suffocating miasma. A chilling, sickly aura of disease and finality poured from his massive frame, chilling the air around him. He became the absolute administrator of mortality, the supreme lord of the grave, commanding the inevitable cessation of all living things and the quiet, decaying end that awaits all creation. The subterranean cavern, once a place of infinite empty silence, was now filled with the terrifying, overwhelming presence of these three newly forged deities. Lord Gwyn, the Witch of Izalith, and Grave Lord Nito stood bathed in the glow of the first flame, their bodies thrumming with the unfathomable power of light, life, and death. They had grown magnificent and colossal, their very existence demanding reverence. Yet amidst the blinding radiance of sunlight, the roaring heat of chaotic fire, and the suffocating miasma of death, there was another. Hidden deep within the dying embers of the first flame, barely visible beneath the ashes, lay a fourth soul. It was a subtle, viscous, lukewarm ember, lacking the overwhelming immediate ferocity of the other three. A fragile, unassuming figure crawled forth from the darkest shadows, careful to avoid the towering gaze of the three great lords. This figure, small and entirely unremarkable, reached out with trembling, soot-stained hands and claimed this quiet, peculiar soul, clutching it tightly to their chest, while Gwyn, the witch, and Nito immediately utilized their newfound power to grow large and magnificent, basking loudly in the glory of the flame and their own divine ascension. This fourth figure did not. They did not sprout majestic armor, nor did they command roaring firestorms or raise an army of the dead. They remained small, fragile, and easily forgotten. Clinging to their unique, dark prize, this unassuming progenitor retreated quietly backward, slipping away from the blinding light of the first flame. They returned to the comforting, enveloping embrace of the dark, understanding a fundamental truth that the three great lords, in their arrogance and newly found glory, completely failed to grasp. This silent figure understood the nature of fire. They knew that a flame, no matter how blinding, no matter how powerful, is ultimately a finite thing. It consumes, it burns, and eventually, inevitably, it must fade. And so, the possessor of the fourth soul waited patiently, shadows, letting the great lords have their immediate, fleeting era of light. The three great lords, oblivious to the quiet departure of the fourth figure, turned their gaze away from the first flame. They looked upward, their eyes piercing the impenetrable darkness toward the oppressive stone ceiling of their subterranean birth. With the power of disparity coursing through their majestic forms, they felt the intoxicating, linear rush of time beginning to flow. The era of perfect stasis, the unchanging grayness of the world above, was deeply offensive to their newly acquired, vibrant divinity. They possessed the light to shatter the fog, the heat to burn away the ancient roots, and the death to end the eternal. They realized their terrible, glorious destiny. They would not remain trapped in the dark of the earth. They would ascend from the depths, break through the unyielding stone, and challenge the absolute, unquestioned dominion of the everlasting dragons. The age of ancients was violently, irrevocably over. Armed with the power of gods, the three lords prepared to march upward, and the silent cosmos braced itself for the catastrophic violence of the coming war. The ascent from the subterranean cradle was a violent, earth-shattering rupture of the world's ancient crust. Lord Gwyn, his golden armor radiating an unnatural, blinding dawn, led the charge upward through the dark. Beside him marched the Witch of Izalith, her chaotic flames chewing through the unyielding stone, and grave Lord Nito, whose very presence caused the ancient, petrified roots to rot and crumble into gray dust. When they finally breached the surface, the dense, suffocating gray fog of the Age of Ancients was pierced for the very first time by the blinding light of the first, Flame's inheritors. The lords looked upon the endless, jagged expanse of the gray crags and the towering, impossible canopies of the arch trees, and they declared war upon the silent eternity. The everlasting dragons, perched high above in their majestic apathy, finally stirred from their permanent slumber. This conflict, forever recorded in the blood-soaked annals of the cosmos as the Dragon War, was an apocalyptic clash between the uncompromising stasis of the past and the chaotic, burning disparity of the future. The initial engagements were nothing short of a massacre for the newly ascended deities. Armed with the unfathomable, surging power of the Lord Souls, the lords sought to rapidly claim the surface world and depose the eternal masters. Yet in their blinding arrogance, they gravely underestimated the absolute nature of the dragon's perfection. The everlasting dragons were not merely heavily armored beasts. Their immortality was absolute, intrinsically tied to the very molecular makeup of their stone scales. When Lord Gwyn's fledgling armies, comprised of primordial humans and newly forged knights who marched in perfect, terrified lockstep, charged into the fray, their weapons proved utterly useless. Swords forged in the roaring fires below shattered like glass upon impact with the dragon's hides. Primitive magic fizzled harmlessly against their mineral flesh, and even the chaotic, roaring heat of early fire sorceries failed to singe a single stone scale. The gray crags quickly became a gruesome slaughterhouse. It was an incredibly protracted and bloody campaign, an impossible war of attrition that threatened to snuff out the Age of Fire before it could ever truly illuminate the sky. For every single majestic dragon that the lords managed to fell, through sheer overwhelming numbers or catastrophic luck, 70 of Lord Gwyn's soldiers perished in vain. The ancient, unblemished stone was stained a horrifying crimson with the blood of mortals and lesser gods alike. The dragons did not fight with passion, malice, or strategy. They fought with the terrifying, unyielding indifference of a natural disaster. They crushed legions beneath their massive, unfeeling claws and swept away entire battalions with the colossal beat of their sweeping wings. A cold, suffocating despair began to take root in the hearts of the lords as they realized their divine power was breaking uselessly against an unbreakable wall. The tide of the war turned not through a triumph of martial prowess or a sudden miraculous surge of divine power, but solely due to a monumental betrayal from within the dragon's own ranks. Among the perfect, immortal host of the everlasting dragons, there was a singular anomaly, a tragic mutation that harbored a deep, festering resentment. His name was Seath the Scaleless. Unlike his ancient kin, whose bodies were clad in impregnable armor, Seath was an albino dragon born without the stone scales of immortality. He was a creature of soft, pale, vulnerable flesh trapped in a world of unyielding mineral. Because he lacked the scales, Seath could feel the biting cold of the fog. He could feel physical pain, and most profoundly, he could feel the creeping, paralyzing dread of his own inescapable mortality. Driven by a profound bitterness over his innate vulnerability and a deep-seated, agonizing jealousy of his immortal brethren, Seath's mind became a dark crucible of hatred and treachery. While his kin sat in perfect, eternal apathy, Seath schemed in the shadows. He allied himself with Lord Gwyn, abandoning the majestic roosts of the archtrees to grovel before the glowing camps of the lords. In the dead of the long, blood-stained night, Seath provided Lord Gwyn with the critical intelligence necessary for victory. He revealed the supreme, fatal secret of his kind. The dragon's stone scales were the absolute source of their immortality, and if those scales could somehow be peeled away or shattered, the eternal dragons could be killed just like any mortal beast. Furthermore, to secure his own artificial, magical immortality, Seath the Scaleless committed the ultimate blasphemy, his kind, by pillaging the primordial crystal, a sacred, ancient artifact of the dragons, bringing its arcane secrets directly to the lords. This unprecedented treason provided Lord Gwyn with the key to dismantling the eternal world. Utilizing Seath's treacherous intelligence, the lords executed a highly coordinated, multifaceted assault that weaponized the very concepts of disparity to devastating effect. They would not just fight the dragons in a clash of muscle and claw, they would systematically unmake them using the raw forces of nature. Lord Gwyn and his divine vanguard took the absolute forefront of this apocalyptic counteroffensive. Gwyn, drawing upon the deepest, most volatile reserves of the soul of light, utilized the blinding power of the sun itself to forge the very first miracles. He did not rely on physical swords, but instead hurled immense radiant spears of golden sunlight directly at the airborne behemoths. These spears of lightning were the physical manifestation of disparity, and they struck with the deafening concussive force of falling stars. The lightning violently shattered the mineral defenses of the dragons, physically peeling apart the ancient stone scales and exposing the soft, vulnerable, and mortal flesh beneath. Lord Gwyn's firstborn son, a peerless god of war, also fought valiantly in this golden vanguard, slaying numerous dragons with his own tremendous lightning armaments, matching his father's fury strike for blinding strike. With the dragons stripped of their immortal protection, plummeting from the sky and screaming in unfamiliar, terrifying agony, the Witch of Izalith stepped forward alongside her devoted daughters of chaos. Drawing upon the volatile soul of life, they wove catastrophic, continent-spanning firestorms of unimaginable scale. They directed their chaotic, roaring flames not just at the screaming dragons, but at the very foundations of the ancient world. They targeted the colossal arch trees, incinerating the dragon's ancestral habitats and burning the ancient petrified wood to glowing cinders. The dense gray fog of the Age of Ancients was violently boiled away, replaced by a thick, choking cloud of black smoke in a continuous, suffocating blizzard of gray ash falling upon the scorched earth. The world was literally burning down around. The dragons, their eternal roosts, reduced to a molten, apocalyptic ruin. Finally, as the broken dragons plummeted from the burning skies, their stone scales shattered, their bodies battered, Grave Lord Nito acted as the ultimate, merciless executioner. Rising from the subterranean depths, like a nightmare given form, Nito unleashed a suffocating, terrifying miasma of death and disease upon the exposed, scaleless dragons. The air turned toxic, a swirling black plague that seeped directly into the open, bleeding wounds carved by Lord Gwyn's lightning. The miasma rotted the dragon, the inside out, infecting their ancient blood and introducing the very concept of mortality to the previously eternal beings. The majestic creatures, who had known nothing but perfect health and stasis since the dawn of time, convulsed and died in agonizing, diseased spasms, their massive bodies deteriorating into rotting husks upon the ash-covered earth. The combination of shattering lightning, chaotic fire, and suffocating plague was absolute. The everlasting dragons were driven to the absolute brink of total extinction. The lords, standing triumphant atop jagged mountains of rotting, draconic corpses, had successfully conquered the surface world. The silent, gray epic was dead, its memory buried beneath mountains of ash, and a new, illuminated world order was violently established upon its ruins. However, the eradication of the ancient masters was not entirely absolute. A select few descendants, distant relatives, and bizarre mutations managed to survive the apocalyptic onslaught, fleeing into the darkest, most isolated corners of the world, clinging desperately to life in the terrifying new era. Deep underground, hidden away in the time-locked sanctuary of Ash Lake, surrounded by the remnants of the unburnt arch trees, the stone dragon remained, a silent observer of the new age. In the squalid, rotting depths beneath what would eventually become human civilization, a distant draconic descendant mutated into the horrifying, insatiable gaping dragon, its body completely deformed by an unending hunger. High in the ancient valleys, the fearsome Calamite, a one-eyed black dragon of terrifying power, survived the culling, harboring a wrath so potent that even the victorious gods of the newly established capital dared not provoke its ire. And lesser, bastardized cousins, known as drakes, would eventually populate the deep, forgotten ravines of the world. Yet these pathetic remnants were merely shadows of their former glory. The everlasting dragons were broken, their eternal reign violently usurped, and the throne of the world now belonged entirely to the Lords of Fire. With the ashes of the eternal creatures settling upon a transformed and newly mortal earth, the first flame roared to its absolute, magnificent zenith, casting off the oppressive, subterranean darkness and bathing the cosmos in a profound, blinding radiance. This was the true genesis of the Golden Age of Fire, a shimmering, glorious epic wherein the victorious deities sought to impose their divine order upon a previously unformed universe. The dense, suffocating fog that had choked the skies for uncountable millennia was violently burned away by the raw, surging power of the Lord of Sunlight. In its place, a brilliant golden sun was set firmly into the firmament, casting radiant, life-giving warmth across a world that was now fundamentally defined by the passage of time, the changing of seasons, and the inescapable cycle of birth and mortality. To cement his absolute supremacy and manifest his divine will into physical reality, Lord Gwyn established a breathtaking capital city at the absolute highest peak of the world. This celestial fortress was named Anor Londo, the fabled City of the Gods. It was a sprawling architectural marvel, completely unlike the jagged, formless crags of the preceding era. Anor Londo was built of gleaming, polished white marble and adorned with towering, intricately carved brass spires that reached eagerly toward the heavens. Immense buttresses supported grand, sweeping cathedrals, and wide, immaculate courtyards were perpetually bathed in a flawless, golden twilight. The city was designed not merely for defense, but as a monument to divine hubris, constructed on a scale so massive that it made the mortal humans who walked its lower steps feel entirely insignificant. It stood as the glittering, unyielding center of the world, radiating an aura of eternal prosperity and unassailable authority. From his resplendent throne within the highest cathedral of Anor Londo, Lord Gwyn established a strict, paternalistic, and highly rigid feudal hierarchy to govern this newborn civilization. He generously rewarded those who had stood by his side during the impossible blood-soaked campaigns of the Dragon War, cementing absolute loyalty through the distribution of immense power. Most notably, the great traitor, Seath the Scaleless, was elevated far above his station as a mere beast. For his instrumental role in securing the eradication of his own immortal kin, Lord Gwyn bestowed upon the pale dragon the prestigious and noble title of Duke. Furthermore, as the ultimate token of gratitude, Lord Gwyn sundered his own magnificent Lord Soul, gifting a potent, radiant fragment of it to the albino dragon. Seath was granted permission to construct a massive, towering repository of knowledge adjacent to the gleaming walls of Anor Londo. This labyrinthine structure became known as the Duke's Archives. Within its towering, book-lined halls, Seath was left entirely unhindered to pursue his obsessive, desperate research into the nature of stone scales and his own elusive quest for true immortality, locking himself away from the golden light of the era he helped forge. The other great lords, who had claimed the disparate power of the First Flame, similarly retreated to establish their own vast domains under the watchful gaze of Anor Londo. Grave Lord Nito, having administered the first true deaths to the ancient dragons, sank back into the absolute pitch-black depths of the earth. He constructed the subterranean tomb of the giants, a lightless, suffocating ossuary where he slumbered, passively administering the natural laws of decay and mortality to all living things across the sunlit world above. The Witch of Izalith, alongside her fiercely loyal daughters, descended to the deep, cavernous ruins beneath the ancient tree roots. There, they built the sprawling, magnificent city of Izalith, a civilization of intricate stone-carved architecture where they studied and perfected the ancient, passionate art of fire sorcery. their roaring flames harmonizing with the distant, pulsing heartbeat of the world above. To maintain peace across the newly formed continents, and to project that absolute military might of the gods, Lord Gwyn consolidated his celestial armies under the leadership of 4 legendary warriors. These were the 4 Knights of Gwyn, the most elite, trusted, and accomplished commanders in all of Lordran. Their names commanded unparalleled respect and terrified reverence. Each of these supreme combatants was granted a special, magically imbued ring denoting their elevated status within the pantheon and enhancing their unique, devastating methodologies of warfare. The vanguard of this elite quartet was led by Captain Ornstein, a warrior whose name became utterly synonymous with the destruction of the ancient dragons. Clad in armor forged to resemble the visage of a roaring golden lion, Ornstein was the very embodiment of the storm. He wielded a tremendously heavy, lugged cross spear that crackled constantly with ferocious lightning. It was written in the annals of Anor Londo that Ornstein's thrusts were so impossibly forceful that a single strike from his spear could cleanly slice a solid, falling boulder completely in 2. In recognition of his piercing, lethal momentum, Lord Gwyn bestowed upon him the Leo Ring, a divine band that greatly strengthened his thrusting counterattacks, making him an unstoppable force of precision and raw power. Fighting alongside him was the Vanguard Knight, Artorias, a warrior possessing an unbendable will of steel and a heart of absolute, unyielding conviction. Artorias fought with a massive, heavy greatsword, his strikes sweeping and relentless. He did not march to war alone. He was forever accompanied by his deeply bonded companion, a magnificent great wolf named Sif, who fought fiercely beside him on the blood-soaked battlefields. Artorias was the bulwark of the divine army, the knight who would never retreat and never surrender, regardless of the horrors that stood before him. For his steadfast resolve, he was gifted the Wolf Ring, an artifact that vastly increased his poise, allowing him to stand firm and unbroken against the most catastrophic blows. In stark contrast to the heavy, crushing presence of Ornstein and Artorias was Kieran, the divine assassin, affectionately and fearfully known as the Lord's Blade. She was the shadow behind the blinding light of the gods, a silent, deadly phantom wrapped in flowing garments and a porcelain mask. While the other knights commanded grand battalions in the open field, Kieran operated in the darkest corners of the world, silently laying waste to the enemies of Lord Gwyn before they could ever raise a banner of rebellion. She danced through combat wielding 2 uniquely curved daggers, the dark silver tracer and the gold tracer, weapons designed not for blocking or grand parries, but for venomous, fatal strikes to the most vulnerable points of the anatomy. Her terrifying, lethal precision was celebrated with the gift of the Hornet Ring, an accessory that dramatically boosted her critical attack damage, ensuring that her assassinations were always swift, silent, and absolute. Completing this legendary circle was Goff, the commander of the Great Archers. Goff was not of the same race as the gods, but a towering, lumbering giant possessing a soul of profound wisdom and legendary, unparalleled marksmanship. He led the mighty legions of archers who hunted the surviving high-flying dragons that dared to darken the skies of the New Age. Wielding a great bow so massive it resembled a siege weapon, Goff could loose arrows the size of javelins with terrifying accuracy, striking distant targets with the concussive force of a falling meteor. Lord Gwyn honored his loyal giant with the Hawk Ring, an artifact that supernaturally extended the range of his bow, allowing his massive, heavy arrows to fly true and fast across impossible distances, clearing the skies of any airborne threat. It is a grim, notable piece of historical trivia that there was another who desperately sought induction into this highest echelon of divine military command. Executioner Smo, a warrior of immense grotesque strength who wielded a colossal great hammer and guarded the grand cathedral of Ahnor Londo, deeply desired a place among the four knights. However, his ambition was permanently denied. Smo possessed a sadistic, horrifying delight in his bloody work as an executioner, harboring an abhorrent tendency to grind the bones of his defeated victims into a grisly paste to consume with his own daily feed. This cannibalistic depravity disgusted Lord Gwyn and the other knights, resulting in Smo's permanent, humiliating exclusion from the elite circle, leaving him to guard the empty halls in bitter, gluttonous resentment. Under the watchful, heavily armed, and paternalistic eye of the gods, the mortal races were allowed to multiply and spread across the fertile lands below the mountains. Human kingdoms began to flourish in the golden warmth of the first flame, completely unaware of the true, dark nature slumbering within their own souls. They built vast, sprawling nations that pledged eternal fealty to the divine pantheon. There was the noble kingdom of Astora, a land renowned across the continents for its chivalrous knights, its superior, unwavering loyalty to the gods, and its master craftsmen who forged weapons and armor of unparalleled elegance. Far to the north stood Balder, the proud motherland of the revered Night King Rendal, a nation celebrated for its disciplined military and its rapid, piercing swordsmanship. The heavy-armored giants of humanity hailed from Beranek, warriors so massive and strong that their towering shields and maces became legendary on the battlefields of mortals. Religion naturally took deep, unshakable root in the hearts of mankind. The nation of Thor Rolund rose to significant geopolitical prominence as the strict, unyielding religious epicenter of the human world, founding the Way of White to enforce the holy worship of Lord Gwyn and manage the spiritual obedience of the masses. In stark, disturbing contrast was the sinister land of Kaharim, a shadowy kingdom associated with ominous figures, dangerous, bleeding weapons, pardoning clerics, and the quiet, fearful worship of the goddess of sin, Velka. For centuries upon centuries, the world operated in a state of absolute, luminous perfection under this strict, golden order. The gods sat upon their marble thrones. The dragons were but a terrifying myth used to frighten misbehaving children, and humanity happily tilled the soil, building castles and cathedrals in the names of their divine masters. It was an era of breathtaking art, profound magical discovery, and monumental architectural achievement. The golden age of fire seemed as though it would stretch on forever, a permanent victory of light over the formless dark. Yet in their blinding arrogance, the gods failed to realize that an age built upon the burning consumption of fuel is fundamentally, inexorably doomed to one day turn to ash. While the gods basked in the golden twilight of their magnificent new capital, completely intoxicated by their own perceived omnipotence and the breathtaking beauty of the world they had forcefully illuminated, they remained willfully blind to the fundamental, inescapable flaw of their existence. They had built an on a foundation of finite energy. They failed to realize that an age built upon the burning consumption of fuel is fundamentally, inexorably doomed to one day turn to cold ash. But there was one entity who understood this cosmological truth from the very moment the first flame ignited in the subterranean depths. This was the fourth figure, that unassuming progenitor who had crawled away from the blinding light while Lord Gwyn, the Witch of Izalith, and grave Lord Nito had proudly ascended to the surface world. This silent, patient observer was the furtive pygmy. To fully comprehend the cosmological crisis that would eventually plague the magnificent kingdom of Lordran and drive its divine pantheon to catastrophic madness, one must first look away from the golden sun and understand the unique, terrifying anatomy of the dark soul. The furtive pygmy had claimed a prize fundamentally different from the dazzling shards of raw power seized by his peers. The souls of light, life, and death were immense, overwhelming, and highly visible forces, but they were ultimately finite reservoirs of energy prone to depletion and eventual exhaustion. When Lord Gwyn bestowed a fragment of his own luminous soul to his chosen knights or to the albino dragon, his own absolute personal power was permanently diminished. His soul was akin to a roaring bonfire. It burned brilliantly, but the wood would inevitably be consumed. The dark soul, however, operated on a completely alien metaphysical principle. When the furtive pygmy pulled this fourth Lord Soul from the dying embers, he did not find a blinding, searing source of heat. Instead, he cradled an extraordinary, viscous, lukewarm lump of gentle humanity. It was a quiet, unassuming force, lacking the immediate, violent ferocity required to shatter stone scales or weave apocalyptic firestorms. Yet, it possessed a singular, terrifying characteristic that the other three Lord Souls entirely lacked. The Dark Soul was capable of infinite divisibility without suffering a proportional loss of its total, absolute power. It functioned less like a burning fire and more like an encroaching shadow. One could fracture a shadow into 10,000 smaller pieces, and yet every single piece remained a perfect, absolute manifestation of the dark, patiently waiting to swell larger as the surrounding light inevitably receded. The furtive pygmy was a creature of profound, unmatched foresight. He looked upon the blinding radiance of the first flame and recognized its inherent tragedy. He knew that the fire, by its very nature, would eventually fade, and the power of light, life, and death would slowly perish with it. Anticipating this inescapable end, and understanding that a prophesied dawn of an age of dark was a cosmological certainty, the pygmy adopted a vastly different, long-term strategy for his lineage. He did not use his soul to construct a sprawling Dravidian-themed city beneath the roots, nor did he forge a celestial fortress upon the highest peaks. Instead, in an act of staggering metaphysical sacrifice, the pygmy shattered his own Lord Soul, tearing the viscous darkness into countless, minuscule fragments. He dispersed these tiny, fragmented pieces of the Dark Soul among his own frail, wandering descendants. These fragments became known throughout history as humanity. They manifested physically as tiny pitch-black sprites of concentrated darkness, characterized most distinctively by their eerie, white, glowing eyes. They were lukewarm to the touch, heavy with an inexplicable nostalgia, and gentle in their unyielding embrace. This monumental act of dispersing his own divine essence to his kin was the true genesis of the human race. Every single human being was born with a tiny, sleeping piece of the dark soul nestled deep within their chest, a quiet, shadowy inheritance waiting for its true era to begin. This foundational truth rendered the actual nature of humanity far more terrifying and complex than the golden gods of Ahnor Londo ever dared to openly admit. To Lord Gwyn and his divine knights, humans appeared as fragile, fleeting creatures. They were beings who tilled the soil, built modest stone villages, suffered from mundane diseases, and died easily upon the tips of unremarkable swords. But this mortal existence was nothing more than a superficial illusion, a temporary byproduct of the overwhelming oppressive presence of the first flame and the radiant age of fire. The natural foundational state of these human beings was in reality akin to a hollow. At their absolute core, stripped of the warm illusions cast by the sun, humans were fundamentally immortal. They were naturally devoid of physical vitality or a traditional finite lifespan. Instead of a beating heart of warm blood, they were sustained entirely by the eternal, unyielding dark residing within their very souls. Because humanity was intrinsically tied to the profound, formless void of the abyss, the very dark that birthed the world, their power did not draw from the first flame at all. The human race was uniquely positioned to thrive in the fire's absolute absence. They did not need the light to see, nor did they need the heat to live. They were creatures of the dark, enduring and infinite. Furthermore, the essence of the dark soul was fundamentally different in temper than the sterile, unyielding order of Lord Gwyn's sunlight. The dark soul was inherently emotional. It was an incredibly dense, concentrated mass of feeling, fueled by raw willpower, overwhelming desire, and insatiable want. While the gods represented a static, perfect, and unchanging hierarchy, humanity represented chaotic ambition. Humans possessed a resilience and an adaptive capacity that the gods found utterly terrifying. A god could be broken if their rigid order was, but a human would simply adapt, driven by an endless dark hunger to survive, to claim, and to multiply in the shadows. The human spirit was a deep, bottomless well of want, drawing its strength from the very emotions that the divine pantheon sought to suppress in the name of perfect, golden tranquility. Despite their latent, infinite potential, the early humans were heavily utilized and subsequently discarded by the very gods they fought beside. During the apocalyptic climax of the Dragon War, the primordial humans, the direct descendants of the furtive pygmy, were heavily conscripted into Lord Gwyn's grand armies. They did not fight with gleaming golden spears or radiant miracles. Instead, plunging into the terrifying depths of the abyss, these early humans forged quasi-living weapons and heavy, dark armor from the formless void. They stood valiantly on the blood-soaked front lines against the immortal, stone-scaled beasts, dying in uncountable droves to secure a victory for a world order that would ultimately reject them. Following the near-total extermination of the everlasting dragons and the triumphant establishment of the Age of Fire, Lord Gwyn looked upon the surviving humans not with gratitude, but with a profound existential dread. He recognized the insidious, self-replicating nature of the dark soul and feared the latent power sleeping within mankind. To secure his absolute rule and his pristine celestial hegemony, Lord Gwyn systematically marginalized the early humans. He isolated the bearers of the dark soul, pushing them into the lower, darker corners of the world, far away from the gleaming spires of Ahnor Londo, actively preventing them from ever threatening his newly established divine hierarchy. The furtive pygmy, having exhausted his physical form by shattering his own divine essence for the sake of his descendants, aged gracefully in the deepest shadows. As he neared the quiet end of his physical existence, he observed the state of the world with a profound, heartbreaking irony. He watched as his human children built grand cathedrals, knelt upon hard stone floors, and offered desperate prayers to the glowing sun in the sky. Humanity worshipped the lords, completely oblivious to the fact that their own innate power, derived directly from the infinite dark soul, was equal to, or perhaps even greater than the might of the terrifying gods they so blindly revered. They begged for scraps of light, ignorant of the vast ocean of dark power they carried within their own flesh. But the pygmy did not despair, nor did he attempt to correct them. He possessed the quiet, terrifying patience of a being who understood the absolute certainty of the cosmos. He patiently waited for the fire to naturally subside. He understood that while Lord Gwyn and the celestial pantheon ruled the glorious golden age of fire, the ensuing era, the age of dark, widely known as the Age of Men, was a complete and unavoidable inevitability. As the millennia ticked by, and the fuel of the first flame inevitably waned, the borrowed power of the gods would falter, and the innate, emotional power of the dark would naturally swell to consume the fading light. The furtive pygmy simply faded into the deepest annals of forgotten history, entirely satisfied in the knowledge that his children, the immortal hollows of the dark, were naturally destined to outlast the golden arrogance of the gods and eventually ascend to rule the cold, quiet ashes of the world. As the quiet ashes of the world waited patiently in the dark, the glorious, golden zenith of Ahnor Londo began its imperceptible, agonizing decline. The fundamental, inescapable flaw of the Age of Fire was its absolute reliance on a consumable source of fuel. A fire, regardless of its divine magnitude or the celestial beings it empowers, must eventually consume that which sustains it. As the uncountable millennia passed in a haze of golden twilight, the first flame, the very source of the gods' unfathomable power and the anchor of the world's disparity, began to dwindle. The fading of the flame was not a sudden, violent extinguishment, but a slow, creeping starvation that terrified the immortal pantheon. The nights, once easily banished by the radiant miracles of the gods, grew longer and colder. The comforting warmth that had blanketed the human kingdoms began to dissipate, replaced by a biting autumnal chill that whispered of an impending permanent winter. The gods, gazing down from their towering, pristine marble spires, felt the horrific sensation of their celestial sovereignty waning. The impending fading of the fire threatened to usher in a catastrophic paradigm shift. Should the first flame die entirely, the Age of Dark would inevitably commence. In this lightless era, the gods would lose their supreme dominance, and humanity, empowered by the ever-growing, infinite strength of the dark soul, would naturally ascend to rule the cold remnants of the earth. Terrified of the encroaching dark and absolutely desperate to maintain the fragile status quo of their celestial hierarchy, the lords sought artificial, highly dangerous means to sustain the dying fire. It was a time of grand desperation, a period where divine hubris drove the most powerful beings in existence to challenge the very laws of the cosmos they had helped to establish. Of all the deities, it was the Witch of Izalith who made the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic attempt to defy the fading of the light. The witch was a being of profound pride and unparalleled magical intellect. Deep underground, she ruled over the sprawling, magnificent city of Izalith, a civilization of intricate stone-carved architecture nestled beneath the colossal roots of a primordial arch-tree. Within these subterranean halls, the witch and her fiercely loyal daughters studied and perfected the ancient, passionate art of flame sorcery. Because she held the soul of life, one of the original, supreme Lord souls pulled from the genesis of disparity, she possessed an unmatched mastery over the essence of warmth and biological creation. Driven by a terrifying mixture of maternal protectiveness for her era and absolute blinding arrogance in her own arcane abilities, the Witch of Izalith formulated a highly perilous ritual. Utilizing her Lord Soul and drawing upon the collective roaring power of her daughters, she attempted to completely duplicate the first flame. She sought to forcefully weave a new, endless source of energy, a secondary sun born not of natural cosmological progression, but of concentrated artificial sorcery. Deep within the grandest cathedral of her subterranean city, the witch channeled a concentration of heat so intense that the very air began to warp and scream. However, the ritual failed spectacularly, resulting in a disaster that would forever scar the bedrock of the world. The witch could not contain or control the volatile, immense energy she sought to harness. Instead of birthing a pure, radiant duplicate of the first flame, her desperate sorcery ruptured the fabric of reality and birthed the flame of chaos. This new flame was a volatile, uncontrollable force of nature, a sickening, erratic fire that burned not with the comforting golden light of the sun, but with a virulent, parasitic intensity. The flame of chaos was an abomination, a corrupted, parasitic fire that instantly and violently consumed the Witch of Izalith. The catastrophic release of this chaotic energy was absolute. The witch was completely subsumed by the very fire she sought to command, mutating instantaneously into a horrific, parasitic entity composed of twisted wood, molten rock, and erratic fire. She was transformed into the bed of chaos, a terrifying, twisted seedbed that served as the biological anchor for a nightmare. The apocalyptic blast of chaos energy rippled outward from the epicenter of the failed ritual, striking the magnificent stone architecture of Izalith with the force of a falling star. The immense heat melted the intricate stone carvings, the towering pillars, and the grand domes, transforming the surrounding underground caverns into a molten, uninhabitable wasteland forever known as the Demon Ruins. From the corrupted, thrashing roots of the bed of chaos, a new, abominable race was violently birthed into the world, the demons. These creatures were born of wrath, pain, and chaotic fire. They were fundamentally different from natural, biological life. Their existence was entirely ephemeral, powered solely by the raging, erratic passing of the chaos flame, lacking any natural immunity to the passage of time, and doomed to be short-lived, violent aberrations that swarmed the molten ruins of the once great city. The apocalyptic tragedy of this event extended directly and most agonizingly to the witch's own family. The daughters of chaos, who had stood loyally by their mother's side during the fateful ritual, were caught directly in the devastating epicenter of the chaotic blast. Their fates were varied in execution, but universally tragic in nature, a horrifying testament to the consequences of defying the natural order. One of the eldest daughters, known as Quaylag, managed to flee the immediate collapse of the burning cathedral. However, the parasitic energy of the chaos flame caught her as she ran, violently mutating her physical form from the waist down. Her divine, beautiful upper torso was agonizingly grafted onto the horrifying, chitinous body of a massive, demonic arachnid. Driven mad by the trauma and the horrifying alteration of her being, Quaylag took up residence in the deep, poisonous swamp known as Blight Town, located far above the molten ruins of her home. There, she fiercely and violently defended her blighted territory, mercilessly harvesting the humanity of any wandering undead to sustain her ailing kin. A profoundly more heartbreaking fate befell her sister, widely known only as the Fair Lady. She suffered the exact same horrifying arachnid mutation as Quaylag, her lower half transformed into a grotesque, chaotic spider. Yet despite her terrifying exterior, the Fair Lady retained a soul of profound, unparalleled gentleness. When she and Quaylag fled into the toxic depths of the swamp, she looked upon the blighted, diseased human inhabitants who languished in the poisonous muck. Overcome with a profound, crushing empathy for these wretched creatures, the Fair Lady made a conscious, agonizing sacrifice. She willingly swallowed the toxic pus that infected the humans, absorbing their horrific diseases into her own divine body to cure them. This completely selfless act of martyrdom overwhelmed her chaotic form, rendering her permanently blind, completely crippled, and locked in a state of perpetual, agonizing pain. She remained hidden in a small, damp alcove behind her sister's domain, surrounded by parasitic eggs that served as cradles for humanity, a dying goddess whispering softly to a sister she could no longer see. The witch's only male descendant suffered a mutation of staggering, colossal proportions. Consumed entirely by the agonizing heat of the chaotic blast, he was transformed into a towering, mindless giant composed entirely of weeping magma and hardened obsidian. He became known as Ceaseless Discharge. Stripped of his sanity and his divine grace, he was doomed to suffer in constant burning pain. He was left to wander the molten caverns of the demon ruins, forever watching over the tiny charred corpse of one of his unnamed sisters, shedding tears of liquid fire that pooled upon the scorched earth in an endless display of monstrous grief. Not all of the daughters mutated into external monsters. Deep within the core of the catastrophe, one daughter, named Grana, managed to retain her humanoid shape, but she was bound by loyalty and trauma to guard the smoking entrance to the bed of chaos. Two other unnamed sisters were entirely unable to escape the pull of the chaotic gravity. They were physically and agonizingly absorbed directly into the bed of chaos itself, their divine bodies serving as the living, biological anchors for the monstrosity that their mother had become. Out of the entire glorious family of fire sorcerers, only one single daughter managed to escape the incident, entirely unmutated. Her name was Quailana. She fled the catastrophic collapse of Izalith, avoiding the grasping, mutating flames of chaos, and eventually wandered into the toxic, oppressive swamps of Blighttown. Though her body remained whole, her mind was stricken with a paralyzing, inescapable survivor's guilt. She was a goddess, forced to wander in filthy rags, mourning the horrific fate of her mother and sisters. Centuries later, attempting to find some semblance of purpose, in a broken world, Quilana took on human pupils, most notably a wandering man named Solomon. She adapted the lost, highly dangerous, and ancient art of true flame sorcery into a far more controlled, primitive practice. This new discipline, born from the ashes of her family's colossal failure, became the modern, widespread practice known as pyromancy. The disaster of Izalith served as a horrifying, undeniable proof to the rest of the divine pantheon. It demonstrated with absolute, catastrophic clarity that the natural progression of the world could not be halted by artificial creation. The first flame could not be duplicated, and any attempt to forge a new sun would only breed twisted, parasitic nightmares. As the news of the demon race, emerging from the molten depths, reached the highest peaks of Anor Londo, Lord Gwyn looked upon his fading golden sun and realized the terrifying truth. He could not weave a new flame. He could only feed the old one, and the only fuel potent enough to sustain the age of fire against the encroaching dark was the very essence of the gods themselves, or the infinite trapped darkness residing within the fragile chests of humanity. With the horrific failure of the Witch of Izalith echoing through the molten caverns of the deep earth, Lord Gwyn stood upon the highest balcony of Anor Londo and stared into the fading golden sun. The apocalyptic birth of the demon race served as an undeniable, terrifying revelation to the Lord of Sunlight. He realized with absolute clarity that the natural progression of the cosmos could never be halted by the artificial creation of a new flame. The first flame could not be mimicked, duplicated, or forged anew through sorcery, no matter how potent the caster might be. The era of the gods was dying, and the only force capable of sustaining the glorious age of fire was a sacrifice of unimaginable, unprecedented magnitude. Driven by a desperate, consuming fear of the encroaching dark and the latent power of humanity, Lord Gwyn made a decision that would forever alter the metaphysical fabric of the universe. He would offer himself to the dying embers. The preparation for this ultimate sacrifice was a solemn, deeply tragic affair. Lord Gwyn, the great king who had hurled blinding sunlight to shatter the immortal dragons, quietly divided his magnificent military force. He gathered exactly half of his legendary Silver Knight army, the absolute elite vanguard of Anor Londo, to accompany him on his final, fateful pilgrimage. The procession marched out of the gleaming, pristine gates of the celestial city, descending the sweeping marble staircases and leaving the golden twilight behind. They marched downward, far below the human kingdoms and the blighted swamps, journeying deep into the subterranean cradle of the earth. Their destination was the very epicenter of creation, the sacred, hidden cavern where disparity was first born, the kiln of the first flame. The descent into the kiln was a journey into a dying heart. The atmosphere grew oppressively hot, yet the surrounding caverns were choked with a heavy, suffocating layer of gray ash. The kiln itself was a monument to profound exhaustion, a massive, ruined hemisphere of melted stone and petrified pillars that seemed to groan under the weight of the world above. In the absolute center of this desolate, ash-choked basin lay the first flame. It was no longer the blinding, roaring inferno that had birthed the Lord's souls at the dawn of time. It was a pathetic, smoldering pile of dying embers, casting long, erratic shadows across the soot-stained walls. The era of the gods was reduced to a fragile, flickering light, desperately gasping for fuel in the encroaching, suffocating darkness. Standing before the dying fire, Lord Gwyn did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his heavy golden armor clanking softly in the deathly quiet of the kiln. He offered his own immensely powerful Lord Soul, the very essence of light and order, as physical fuel to the fading fire. The king of the gods stepped directly into the smoldering center and burned himself alive. The immolation of a supreme deity was a cataclysmic event, a blinding, deafening explosion of pure, agonizing energy erupted from the kiln, a shockwave of concentrated heat and desperate, artificial life that rippled upward through the very bedrock of the world. The knights who had faithfully followed their lord into the depths were caught directly in the apocalyptic backdraft of this sacrificial explosion. The sheer, unfathomable heat of the blast instantly scorched their pristine, gleaming silver armor completely black. Their heavy shields were melted and deformed, their weapons warped by the extreme temperatures, and their physical bodies were entirely incinerated, leaving behind nothing but disembodied, wandering spirits bound to the blackened metal. These tragic figures became the Black Knights, doomed to roam the ruined landscapes of Lordran as hollowed, charred sentinels, forever searching for a king who no longer truly existed. Within the roaring epicenter of the renewed fire, Lord Gwyn underwent a horrific, tragic metamorphosis. By burning away his divine essence to artificially extend his golden age, he was entirely stripped of his celestial majesty. The glorious Lord of was reduced to a hollowed, mindless husk. His golden crown became tarnished and fused to his charred flesh, his majestic robes reduced to ragged, smoking ash. He became the Lord of Cinder, a pathetic, violently territorial shell of his former self. Completely devoid of reason, mercy, or memory, he remained trapped within the kiln of the first flame, raising his greatsword to violently slaughter anyone who dared approach the fire he had sacrificed his very soul to protect. This desperate, agonizing sacrifice was eventually termed the first sin, and its consequences were cosmologically catastrophic. By offering his immense soul to forcefully and artificially extend the age of fire, Lord Gwyn fundamentally fractured the natural laws of the universe. The natural progression of time, which had flowed linearly since the dawn of disparity, was abruptly broken. Time and space in the land of Lordran became convoluted, severely stagnant, and terrifyingly unstable. The fabric of reality began to tear and fold upon itself, causing heroes, realms, and kingdoms of entirely different centuries to randomly phase in and out of existence. The world was trapped in a sickening, unnatural stasis, a paralyzed reality shivering between a fire that refused to die and a darkness that was violently denied its rightful turn. Yet the fracturing of time was only a byproduct of a much more insidious, calculated cruelty. Before his descent into the kiln, Lord Gwyn's profound existential fear of humanity and his terror of the impending Age of Dark led to the systemic, deliberate weaponization of the undead curse. He recognized that if the fire faded, the latent power of the dark soul residing within mankind would naturally awaken, and the immortal, abyssal humans would inherit the earth. To prevent this, the divine pantheon orchestrated a metaphysical atrocity that shackled the very essence of the human race. To comprehend this atrocity, one must understand the hidden physiological truth of the human soul. The true nature of humanity is intrinsically, inseparably linked to the deep abyss and the fragmented dark soul. The human body naturally houses a terrifying metaphysical phenomenon known to scholars as the dark sigil. This sigil is not a physical mark, but rather a gaping, bottomless void nestled deep within the spiritual core of every human being. From this pitch-black chasm, the raw, emotional, and infinite darkness of humanity threatens to naturally seep outward, a creeping shadow that terrified the golden gods of Ahnor Londo. Fearing the unchecked, boundless power of this dark seepage, the gods cast a powerful, oppressive magical boundary upon early humanity. This unnatural boundary was a seal of fire, a divine shackle designed to perfectly contain the abyssal nature of mankind. This agonizing seal is universally known as the dark sign. It manifests physically as a ring of blazing, cursed fire that perfectly surrounds the dark void of the human soul, a burning brand placed upon the flesh to trap the infinite darkness within. During the glorious height of the Age of Fire, when the first flame burned brilliantly and the power of the gods was absolute, this dark sign remained largely dormant. The overwhelming strength of the sun suppressed the dark, allowing humans to live seemingly normal, mortal lives, blissfully unaware of the fiery shackles binding their souls. But as the first flame began its inevitable decline and the power of light waned across the cosmos, the dark sign violently awakened. When the fire fades, the fiery seal weakens, and the suppressed darkness within the dark sigil desperately attempts to leak out into the world. This internal, metaphysical conflict manifests as the horrifying Undead curse. The dark sign absolutely prevents the human soul from passing on to experience a natural, peaceful death. Instead, when a human is struck down, the weakened but still active ring of fire forcefully resurrects them. The dark sign actively, agonizingly burns away the humanity, the precious, lukewarm fragments of the dark soul, as it tries to escape the gaping void. This continuous, internal burning comes at an unimaginable psychological cost. Without their humanity to anchor their emotions and their willpower, a human slowly loses everything that defines them. With every single death and forced resurrection, the dark sign burns away a fraction of the individual's sanity, their precious memories, and their very sense of identity. They forget the faces of their loved ones, they forget the warmth of their homes, and eventually, they forget their own names. This excruciating psychological deterioration reduces the once proud human into a mindless, violently erratic husk known as a hollow. Hollowing is the ultimate degradation, stripping away all cognitive thought until nothing remains but a feral, agonizing hunger for souls and humanity. A miserable state of being driven only by raw, animalistic instinct. The dark sign thus traps the human race in an endless, agonizing loop of death, forced resurrection, and mental decay. The gods designed a system of perfect, cruel efficiency. To temporarily stave off the terrifying, creeping numbness of the hollowing process, the afflicted undead are forced to seek out and harvest localized shards of floating humanity from other beings. But simply possessing this humanity is not enough. The undead are compelled by a desperate, magical instinct to feed these precious, dark sprites directly into the bonfires that dot the ruined landscapes. These bonfires are not mere campsites. They are mystical nodes intrinsically linked to the dying first flame at the center of the world. By forcing the undead to sacrifice their collected humanity to the flames, the gods ensured a steady supply of fuel for their fading age. Lord Gwyn did not cure the encroaching dark. He merely shackled it, forging a brilliantly sadistic system that forces humanity to cannibalize its own metaphysical essence. The human race was unknowingly transformed into a vast, suffering flock of kindling, forced to repeatedly burn their own souls to artificially sustain the dying golden era of their divine oppressors. Despite the monumental, agonizing sacrifice of Lord Gwyn at the kiln of the first flame, the encroaching dark could not be entirely suppressed. The first sin was a desperate, violent measure that merely paused the cosmic clock. It did not destroy the inevitable turning of the age. The darkness that the gods so profoundly feared was not merely a passive, natural phenomenon waiting patiently for the fire to die. It was actively, insidiously cultivated by ancient manipulative forces that predated the Age of Fire itself. These were the primordial serpents, those imperfect toothies that had lurked in the abyssal depths since the silent, unformed days of the Grey Crags. While the golden deities clung fiercely to their fading light and sacrificed their own souls to maintain a stagnant world, the serpents moved through the subterranean shadows, actively whispering to the vulnerable hearts of humanity, desiring nothing more than the violent dawn of the Age of Dark. Centuries prior to the present era of ruins and hollows, there existed a peaceful, culturally rich human kingdom known as U-La-Seal. Nestled in a lush, ancient forest, U-La-Seal was a realm defined by its golden-hued woods and its profound, harmonious connection to arcane knowledge. Unlike the rigid, militant kingdoms that worshipped the blinding miracles of sunlight, the citizens of U-La-Seal were renowned for their gentle, non-offensive sorceries. They did not forge magic to conquer or destroy. Their spells were delicate manipulations of light and utility, focusing on the subtle arts of casting illusions, rendering themselves invisible, or repairing broken armaments. It was a tranquil, historically isolated kingdom, blissfully ignorant of the grand, terrifying cosmological struggles raging between the dying gods and the encroaching void. The people of U-La-Seal were gentle scholars, entirely unequipped to face the absolute, raw horror of the true dark. It was exactly this innocent, scholarly curiosity that the primordial serpent, Cath, expertly weaponized. Rising from the lightless depths of the earth, his massive, terrifyingly toothy visage emerged in the shadowed groves of the kingdom. Cath did not come with an invading army or a display of catastrophic power. He came with honeyed words and the seductive, forbidden promise of ancient, untapped knowledge. He spoke to the foremost sorcerers of U-La-Seal, twisting their innocent pursuit of arcane understanding into a dangerous, obsessive hubris. The serpent whispered of a primordial secret buried deep beneath the foundations of their beautiful, golden township. He manipulated the sorcerers into believing that beneath their feet lay the absolute genesis of human power, an ancient truth that could elevate their delicate sorceries to unfathomable, godlike heights. Driven by this manufactured, insatiable curiosity, the people of Ulasil began to dig. They plunged their pickaxes into the ancient stone, delving deeper and deeper into the lightless earth, far past the roots of their beautiful forests. Deep within the suffocating darkness, exactly as the serpent Kath had promised, they unearthed a forgotten ancient grave. Within this primordial tomb lay the primeval man, a being known as Mahnus. Scholars and historians of later eras would endlessly debate his true identity, with many theorizing that Mahnus was, in fact, the furtive pygmy himself, the original progenitor of the human race who had first claimed the dark soul at the dawn of disparity. Regardless of his true name, Mahnus possessed an incredibly dense, concentrated, and extraordinary mass of ancient humanity within his ancient sleeping form. The sorcerers of Ulasil, completely blinded by their ambition and the deceptive whispers of the serpent, did not revere this ancient ancestor. Instead, they treated Mahnus as a fascinating, arcane specimen to be dissected and exploited. They dragged his slumbering primordial body from his grave and chained him to a heavy stone pole within their deepest, darkest dungeons. There, they subjected the primeval man to unspeakable, agonizing torture. They probed his ancient soul with their magic, attempting to forcefully extract and understand his potent, foundational humanity. They subjected his physical form to excruciating pain, studying the reactions of his dark essence. The physical torment was absolute, but it was a psychological cruelty that ultimately shattered the ancient man's mind. The sorcerers stole a precious, magical pendant from Mahnus, an artifact that held deep, unquantifiable nostalgia, and served as the solitary emotional tether to his fading sanity. The theft of this precious pendant, combined with the excruciating physical and psychological torment, drove Mahnus utterly and completely mad. The immense, concentrated humanity within his soul, the raw emotional essence of the dark soul itself, went completely wild. It violently expanded, rejecting the physical confines of his human body. The resulting explosion was not one of heat or light, but of pure, crushing darkness. Mahnus's humanity tore a massive, jagged rifts in the very fabric of reality, creating a localized, terrifying phenomenon known as the Chasm of the Abyss. This was not merely an absence of light. The abyss was a heavy, viscous, physical manifestation of chaotic dark energy, a suffocating tar-like substance that swallowed all sound, all light, and all hope. The catastrophic eruption of the abyss did not remain contained within the deep dungeons. It leaked rapidly upward, a virulent metaphysical plague that seeped into the very foundations of the golden township of Ulasil. The gentle, scholarly citizens were caught completely unaware. As the heavy, suffocating dark washed over them, it violently and grotesquely mutated their physical forms. The abyss reacted to the innate darkness within their own human souls, twisting their flesh into horrific, bloated mockeries of humanity. Their skulls cracked and expanded, their heads transforming into massive, pus-filled monstrosities covered in countless glowing red eyes. Their limbs grew disproportionate and feral. The tranquil citizens became screaming, rabid beasts, driven completely mad by the overwhelming, concentrated emotion of the raw dark. Even the delicate, light-bending magic of Ulasil was fundamentally corrupted by this disaster. The local sorcerers, their minds shattered and their bodies warped by the creeping abyss, developed a terrifying new discipline, abyssal sorceries. These were not the gentle illusions of their past. Abyssal sorceries were heavy, physical manifestations of dark magic, spells that hit with the crushing, concussive force of solid stone. They were driven entirely by innate, unchecked human emotions, profound envy, overwhelming love, and burning desire. The spells cast black flames that ate through magical defenses and dark fogs that poisoned the mind and body. The golden, peaceful kingdom was instantaneously transformed into a chaotic, screaming nightmare of blood, madness, and suffocating darkness. The catastrophic, explosive birth of the abyss sent a terrifying tremor through the very bedrock of the world, a vibration of pure dark that was immediately felt by the gods' peaks of Anor Londo. Recognizing that this unchecked, abyssal outbreak posed an absolute existential threat to the Age of Fire, the Divine Pantheon initiated a desperate containment protocol. They dispatched their most elite, unyielding warrior to halt the spread of the dark. Knight Artorias, the vanguard of the Four Knights, was sent into the corrupted, ruined kingdom of Ulasil. Accompanied by his fiercely loyal great wolf companion Sif, Artorias marched down from the celestial city, a solitary beacon of divine light descending into the screaming maw of the abyss. Artorias possessed an unbendable will of steel, a mental fortitude that the gods believed would allow him to resist the maddening emotional pull of the dark. He fought with a massive, heavy greatsword, and he carried a specially forged silver pendant, a divine artifact designed explicitly to repel the heavy, physical manifestations of dark magic. The legend of Artorias the Abyss Walker began here, a tale of a glorious, unyielding knight who would boldly traverse the dark and strike down the abominations that threatened the Golden Order. He carved a bloody path through the twisted, bloated citizens of the corrupted township, his great sword severing the mutated limbs of the sorcerers who now howled like feral beasts in the shadows. However, Artorias was fundamentally unprepared for the sheer, overwhelming malice of the environment he had entered. The treacherous, maddened citizens of Ulasil, driven by the envious, hateful emotions of the abyss, ambushed the divine knight. In a moment of chaotic, desperate violence, they managed to steal the protective silver pendant, hiding it away behind an illusory wall and stripping Artorias of his absolute defense against the dark magic. Left acutely vulnerable, Artorias and his wolf companion, Sif, descended into the deepest, darkest depths of the chasm of the abyss, seeking to confront the source of the nightmare. There, in the absolute crushing blackness of the deepest cavern, they found Manus, who had mutated into the colossal, terrifying father of the abyss, a towering monstrosity of raw, chaotic dark energy and immense, crushing physical strength. The ensuing battle was not a glorious duel. It was a desperate, one-sided slaughter. Despite his peerless martial prowess and his unyielding will, Knight Artorias was vastly, tragically outmatched by the raw, overwhelming power of Manus. The father of the abyss battered the divine knight with massive, crushing blows of dark energy, shattering his defenses and breaking his physical form. As the heavy, suffocating dark began to close in, Artorias realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that he was going to be defeated. In his final, agonizing moments of lucidity, his thoughts turned not to the preservation of his own glorious life or the defense of the gods, but solely to the safety of his innocent, bonded companion. In a final, heartbreaking act of heroism, Artorius abandoned his offensive stance. He unstrapped his massive divine cleansing great shield from his arm, infusing the shield with the last vestiges of his remaining light and strength. He erected a protective, impenetrable magic barrier completely around the young wolf Sif. Artorius sacrificed his shield, his defense, and his life, leaving himself entirely exposed to the crushing, corrupting force of the Father of the Abyss to ensure that his companion would survive the nightmare. Without his shield and without his silver pendant, Artorius was instantly, violently consumed by the dark. The abyss seeped directly into his wounds, corrupting his divine blood and completely shattering his unbendable mind. His left arm was violently broken, hanging uselessly at his side. His gleaming armor was corroded, stained black and oozing with thick, abyssal sludge. The legendary Vanguard Knight was reduced to a rabid, mindless beast, howling in unimaginable agony, wielding his blunted greatsword with erratic, feral desperation. The gods of Anor Londo, utterly terrified by the reality that their greatest champion had been effortlessly consumed by the dark, fabricated a grand, sweeping lie. They masked their catastrophic failure, cementing his false, unblemished legend as the Abyss Walker, hiding the tragic reality that the hero had fallen and that the true victor over the Abyss was an unnamed warrior dragged through the convolutions of time, ensuring the god's pristine facade remained entirely untarnished by the crushing weight of the dark. While the tragedy of the Golden Township was violently scrubbed from the divine archives, ensuring the god's pristine facade remained entirely untarnished by the crushing weight of the dark, a similar, arguably more devastating catastrophe was brewing far closer to the celestial capital. Deep below the sunlit peaks of Anor Londo, nestled within a massive cavernous expanse of unyielding stone, lay the thriving subterranean metropolis of New Londo. This was not a realm of golden gods or ancient petrified dragons, but a sprawling, magnificent city built entirely by the hands of humanity. Unlike the muddy, disease-ridden settlements that would later define human existence in the fading age, New Londo was a breathtaking beacon of robust culture, enlightened leadership, and unparalleled prosperity. The architecture was grand and imposing, a testament to the staggering heights mortal men could achieve when they were bathed in the warm, protective light of the first flame. The city was a labyrinth of grand avenues, towering stone arches, and deep, quiet cloisters. It was particularly renowned throughout the known world for its advanced, miraculous healing sorceries, such as the widely celebrated remedy spell, a discipline of magic that brought profound comfort, health, and unprecedented longevity to its countless, happy citizens. The governance of this magnificent, subterranean realm was entrusted to a council of 4 human leaders, universally known and deeply revered as the 4 Kings. These men were celebrated across the continents not for their martial prowess or capacity for violence, but for their profound, unparalleled wisdom and their remarkably fair, enlightened rule. Even Lord Gwyn himself, from his unimaginably high marble throne in the city of the gods, had looked down upon the deep cavern of New Londo and formally acknowledged the city's greatness and its immense strategic importance to his golden age. In a rare, unprecedented display of divine favor and profound trust toward the human race, the Lord of Sunlight gifted the four kings with a magnificent, radiant fragment of his very own Lord Soul. This staggering bestowal of celestial power officially granted them the absolute title of kings and cemented their sprawling city as an eternal, unshakable ally to the Golden Pantheon. For centuries, New Londo stood as a shining, undisputed example of human potential, a bustling, prosperous jewel carefully hidden within the dark rock of the deep earth. However, as the uncountable millennia dragged on and the first flame began its inevitable, agonizing decline, the watchful paternalistic gaze of the gods began to falter. As the celestial deities slowly abandoned the lands of Lordran to secure their fading era and retreat to the safety of their illusions, the shadows within the deep, subterranean caverns of New Londo began to lengthen in the absence of divine light. From the pitch-black, suffocating depths of the absolute abyss, the primordial serpent Darkstalker Kath emerged once more, sliding silently and unnoticed into the prosperous human city. Unlike the explosive, catastrophic manipulation that had so violently doomed the ancient sorcerers of the Golden Township, Kath's infiltration of New Londo was a masterclass in insidious political corruption, operating on deep, ancient motives centered entirely around the cultivation of a true Dark Lord to usurp the fading fire. Kath sought out the celebrated leaders of this great city. He slithered into the grand halls of the Four Kings, his massive, toothy visage hidden securely in the long, flickering shadows of their grand throne room. The serpent targeted the highly specific psychological vulnerabilities of these supposedly wise men, their overwhelming pride, their deep-seated fear of the fading light, and their slowly crumbling faith in the absentee gods of Nor Londo. The kings had watched the sun begin to dim, and they had felt the divine power of their Lord Soul fragment noticeably wane as the era died. In their moment of profound, existential doubt, Kath dangled a forbidden, intensely seductive secret before them. The serpent introduced the Four Kings to the darkest, most terrifying application of human essence ever conceived, the forbidden art of life drain. This was not a gentle healing sorcery or a radiant miracle of light. Life drain was a devastating, violent manifestation of the Dark Soul's true, unchecked, and infinite power. Kath revealed to the kings that humans did not need to be subservient to the fading fire, nor did they need to passively suffer the agonizing, slow decay of their era. The art of life drain allowed the user to physically reach into the chest of another living being and forcefully, violently extract their humanity, the precious, lukewarm, dark fragments of the soul. By mercilessly harvesting, the user could consolidate immense, abyssal power, effectively casting off the heavy, burning shackles placed upon them by the terrified gods. It was an intoxicating, absolute power, promising the king's eternal dominance, unyielding strength, and absolute sovereignty in the rapidly approaching Age of Dark. Unable to resist the overwhelming allure of this immense, independent power, the Four Kings fell entirely, willingly, and completely to the seductive promises of the dark. Their profound, celebrated wisdom was instantly eclipsed by a ravenous, insatiable hunger for the essence of their fellow man. This absolute corruption did not remain confined to the throne room. It rapidly trickled down through the ranks of their once noble military. The elite knights who had sworn sacred oaths to protect the innocent citizens of New Londo were horrifyingly transformed into the dreaded dark wraiths. Stripped entirely of their humanity, their compassion, and their honor, these corrupted knights donned terrifying skeletal armor that mocked the inherent frailty of the mortal human form. They were gifted ominous, pulsing red-eye orbs by the primordial serpent, arcane, bleeding artifacts that allowed them to violently and supernaturally invade the worlds of other beings. The dark wraiths used these orbs to mercilessly hunt other humans, crossing the boundaries of time and space to violently harvest humanity for their voracious lords. New Londo descended rapidly into an absolute, screaming nightmare. The magnificent subterranean metropolis that was once renowned for its healing arts became a sprawling, blood-soaked abattoir. The skeletal dark wraiths roamed the grand paved streets, their dark, grasping hands glowing with the terrifying, violet power of life drain as they mercilessly slaughtered their own innocent citizens, feeding the stolen, weeping humanity directly to their corrupted kings. At the very center of the city, fueled by this massive, violent influx of concentrated, harvested dark energy, a new abyss violently tore open in the bedrock. This localized void threatened to rapidly expand and consume the entire world above. The four kings, deeply and inextricably tethered to this newly opened chasm, underwent a horrifying physical mutation. Their regal human forms were completely obliterated, twisted and stretched by the freed power of the dark soul into towering, multi-horned spectral entities, monstrosities bound eternally to the lightless void they had so arrogantly sought to harness for their own political gain. The sheer magnitude of this localized disaster sent a paralyzing shockwave of terror through the remaining enforcers of the divine order. A legion of humans, entirely empowered by the unrestrained dark, freed from the burning shackles of the dark sign, and wielding the terrifying ability to consume souls directly, posed an unparalleled, apocalyptic, and existential threat to the gods. It was a crisis that could not be solved with heavy greatswords or blinding spears of lightning. Recognizing that the entire city was completely lost to the creeping abyss, a desperate, utterly merciless, and genocidal containment protocol was swiftly initiated by those who still served the light. 3 highly respected sorcerers, universally known throughout the lands for their unmatched mastery over restorative magics and distinguished by their heavy, crimson robes, were called upon to immediately handle the escalating crisis. These 3 individuals became forever known to history as the Sealers. Their names were Ingward, Yulva, and a third whose true identity has been entirely lost to the unforgiving, destructive march of history. The 3 Sealers descended to the cavernous roof overlooking New Londo, staring down upon the screaming, dark-infested metropolis. They were faced with an impossible, agonizing dilemma. They could not fight the overwhelming army of dark wraiths, nor could they muster the magical strength to close the physical tear of the abyss. The only conceivable way to stop the dark from seeping upward and destroying the world was to completely and permanently bury it. The three sealers made the horrifying, utilitarian decision to completely flood the entirety of New Lundo. The sheer, staggering cruelty of this act lay in its absolute suddenness. No evacuation order was ever issued, no warning bells were rung in the streets, and absolutely no mercy was granted to the thousands of uncorrupted citizens who still hid terrified in their homes. The massive ancient floodgates holding back the vast subterranean lakes were forcefully, magically thrown open. Millions of gallons of cold, crushing black water surged violently into the cavern, crashing down upon the grand architecture of the city like a wrathful liquid mountain. The floodwaters violently consumed the paved streets, bursting through the stained glass windows of the grand cathedrals and completely filling the deep, dark dungeons. The robust culture, the centuries of enlightened leadership, and the unmatched advancements in healing sorceries were instantly washed away in a deafening, frothing roar of total destruction. But the true, unforgivable horror was the human cost. Countless thousands of innocent civilians, men, women, and children who had desperately hidden in their homes from the roaming dark wraiths, were trapped by the sudden overwhelming deluge. The rushing water, heavily infused with divine magical sealing properties tied directly to the celestial magic of Anor Londo, offered absolutely no escape. The innocent citizens drowned in the pitch-black, freezing water, their desperate final screams silenced forever by the crushing watery grave. The apocalyptic flood successfully served its grim, merciless purpose. The rushing heavy waters plunged deep into the center of the ruined city, filling the newly opened chasm and effectively trapping the mutated four kings and their sprawling army of skeletal dark wraiths deep beneath the immense crushing pressure of the subterranean lake. The localized nightmare was completely contained, successfully buried beneath a watery magical seal, forcing the abyssal monsters to wait in a state of suspended animation for centuries in the absolute freezing dark. However, the catastrophic sacrifice of the innocent population left a permanent, agonizing metaphysical scar upon the ruins. The anguished, profoundly terrified souls of the countless drowned victims could not pass on to any peaceful afterlife. They remained trapped within the flooded, rotting ruins of their beloved city, twisted by the sheer trauma of their horrific final moments into malevolent, entirely untouchable ghosts. These non-corporeal entities possessed jagged blades of spectral energy and wailed in eternal, deafening agony, fiercely guarding the submerged streets and serving as a grim, horrifying historical testament to the absolute genocidal lengths the desperate gods would go to suppress the rise of the dark. The psychological weight of this mass execution ultimately shattered the resolve of the sealers. The sheer, overwhelming guilt of directly drowning a thriving human civilization proved entirely too much to bear. Yulvach, completely overcome by exhaustion and profound, paralyzing remorse, abandoned her sacred post entirely. She took her advanced healing arts and fled far away, attempting to find some desperate measure of redemption by attempting to cure the blighted, poisoned inhabitants of a distant, toxic swamp, a fool's errand that ultimately and tragically claimed her life in the mud. The unnamed third sealer also forsook their solemn duty, abandoning the flooded ruins alongside Yulva, their ultimate fate remaining a complete mystery swallowed forever by the obscure, rotting pages of history. Only one single sealer remained behind in the dark. Ingward, forever clad in his distinctive crimson robes, chose to bear the unimaginable, crushing burden of their collective sin. He became the sole remaining guardian of the seal. For untold centuries, Ingward stood a lonely vigil atop the haunted, crumbling roof of the flooded city, surrounded every moment by the wailing, angry ghosts of the very people he had murdered. He guarded the single key to the floodgates, ensuring with his very life that the water would never recede, and that the terrifying dark wraiths would never again threaten the fragile, fading order of the world. He was a tragic, solitary sentinel, a man entirely defined by the horrific necessity of his past, staring endlessly down into the dark, rippling water that hid the greatest, most heartbreaking atrocity of his age. While Ingward maintained his lonely, tragic vigil over the cold, rippling expanse of the flooded city, ensuring that the corrupted remnants of humanity remained entombed beneath the waves, an even older, more foundational authority lay sleeping far beneath the water table. Deeper than the sunken, ruined spires of New Lundo, deeper than the twisting roots of the ancient world, and completely untouched by the golden, fading light of the celestial capital above, lay a suffocating, pitch-black domain. This was the absolute bottom of the world, a lightless, sprawling ossuary known to fearful scholars as the Tomb of the Giants. It was here, in the cold, dry dark, that the third great lord of the primordial epic had established his silent, unchanging kingdom. This was the domain of Grave Lord Nito, the first of the dead. Unlike the Lord of Sunlight, who sought to aggressively illuminate the cosmos and enforce a strict, radiant hierarchy, or the Witch of Izalith, whose chaotic flames roared with catastrophic, uncontrollable biological creation, Grave Lord Nito desired only a perfect, decaying silence. He was not a god of gleaming, polished armor or radiant, blinding miracles. Nito was a literal, terrifying amalgamation of countless skeletal remains, a towering, mountainous mass of brittle bone, skulls, and rotting marrow held tightly together by an oppressive, suffocating miasma of dark and disease. Following the apocalyptic climax of the Dragon War, where he had unleashed his toxic plagues to rot the ancient, scaleless beasts from the inside out, Nito had completely retreated from the chaotic, political affairs of both gods and men. He sank into the deepest, darkest recesses of the subterranean earth, desiring only to passively, quietly administer the natural laws of decay and mortality to all living things across the sunlit world above. His massive presence in the Tomb of the Giants transformed the cavern into a primordial void, a suffocating space that some ancient scholars recognized as the very first manifestation of an abyss. It was a quiet, cold void where the darkness released from dying beings was perfectly satisfied and settled by a piece of Nito's immense Lord soul, ensuring the natural, peaceful cessation of existence. In the early golden centuries of the Age of Fire, Nito's role was absolute and entirely unchallenged. Everything that lived would eventually, inevitably, bow to the first of the dead. He was the quiet executioner, sleeping deeply in the dark, breathing his invisible miasma into the roots of the world to maintain the necessary fundamental balance of disparity. However, the divine desperate hubris of Lord Gwyn completely shattered this ancient, necessary equilibrium. When the Lord of Sunlight committed the first sin, artificially extending his golden age and placing the fiery seal of the dark sign upon early humanity, he did not merely trap the human race in an agonizing cycle of hollowing. He fundamentally and permanently disrupted Gravelord Nito's absolute jurisdiction. By rendering humanity cursed with endless undeath and violently preventing their natural peaceful passage into the void, the dark sign forcefully robbed the first of the dead of his rightful harvest. The dead were no longer staying dead. They were being forcefully, painfully resurrected by the burning brand, their physical forms rotting while their dark souls were continuously, artificially tethered to the dying first flame. Nito's quiet, perfect domain was effectively bypassed by the panicked, terrified machinations of the celestial pantheon. In response to this massive, unprecedented disruption of the natural order, or perhaps in an earlier, highly classified collaboration with the Golden Capital to manage the terrifyingly growing human population, a dark, necromantic administration was formalized. This cruel administration was centered entirely around a sacred, deeply horrifying clerical secret known as the Rite of Kindling. The rite was a powerful, necromantic process originally held closely by the religious elite, allowing the bonfires, the mystical nodes linked to the fading sun, to be massively bolstered and burn vastly brighter. But this increased brilliance came at a terrible, gruesome cost. The rite of kindling operated by literally feeding on and incinerating concentrated shards of humanity. By forcefully tossing the physical, lukewarm manifestations of the dark soul directly into the roaring flames, the very essence of human life was effectively, violently executed. This agonizing process was deeply and inextricably intertwined with Nito's own necromantic authority and his profound, innate ability to devour light and life. The rite ensured that even though the cursed humans could no longer natural death, their fundamental essence could still be systematically, religiously destroyed to serve the fading era. It further mercilessly tied the human race to the agonizing maintenance of the flame, violently accelerating their psychological hollowing by demanding they constantly sacrifice their own inner darkness to the bonfires. Despite this horrific administrative adjustment to the laws of mortality, Gravelord Nito remained in a state of profound, apathetic isolation within the pitch-black depths of his lightless tomb. He slumbered heavily, an uncaring mountain of bone and miasma, completely indifferent to the crumbling architecture of the world above. It was precisely this absolute, profound solitude, this uncaring silence, that allowed a tragic rogue entity to successfully infiltrate the deepest levels of the catacombs and violate the sanctity of the first of the dead. This brazen infiltrator was a twisted, deeply tragic necromancer known only to history as Pinwheel. Pinwheel was not a grand god of the celestial city, nor was he a majestic dragon or a proud, heavy-armored knight. He was a grotesque, unnatural, and deeply pitiful entity, a horrifying amalgamation of flesh, fabric, and bone. His physical body was painstakingly grafted together from 3 distinct, separate human corpses. Upon his hunched, shrouded shoulders rested 3 distinct faces, each wearing a chilling, static mask representing a different familial archetype: the stern mask of the father, the compassionate mask of the mother, and the innocent mask of the child. This grafted existence was not born of a desire for cosmic dominance, nor was Pinwheel an agent of the encroaching abyss seeking to violently overthrow the gods. The prevailing cosmological analysis suggests a far more intimate, deeply heartbreaking motivation for his blasphemous actions. Pinwheel was a desperate, maddened human driven entirely by a complete inability to accept the cold finality of natural death. Surrounded by ancient books, rotting scrolls, and piles of dusty corpses in his sprawling, coffin-filled lair within the upper catacombs, Pinwheel was obsessively engaged in a futile, maddened attempt to perfectly resurrect his own lost, deceased family. He employed highly forbidden amateur necromancy to mimic the multi-bodied, amalgamated form of Grave Lord Nito. He desperately stitched the cold corpses of his wife and child directly to his own flesh in a psychotic, tragic attempt to literally keep his family together in a world that had cruelly taken them away. Driven by this blinding, pathetic grief, Pinwheel managed to silently slink down from the dusty crypts, descending into the suffocating, pitch-black abyss of the Tomb of the Giants. He crept past the colossal, ancient skeletons that blindly guarded the dark and approached the massive, slumbering sarcophagus of the first of the dead. There, with trembling, grafted hands, Pinwheel successfully committed an act of unprecedented, staggering audacity. He stole the sacred, terrifying power of the Grave Lord. He successfully absconded with the rite of kindling, tearing the sacred clerical secret from the apathetic, skeletal grasp of the sleeping god. Pinwheel rapidly retreated back to the sprawling, labyrinthine tunnels of the upper catacombs, clutching the stolen power of absolute death in his mismatched hands. He utilized this immense, stolen necromantic energy not to challenge the celestial gods, but to violently command the countless skeletons that littered the underground crypts. He animated the dry bones, forcing them to relentlessly reassemble themselves every time they were shattered, creating an endless, rattling army of the dead to guard his profane, grieving research. Pinwheel reigned over the upper catacombs as a pathetic, tragic imitation of the true god of death sleeping in the dark far below. He used his stolen power to conjure endless, fragile illusions of himself, filling his subterranean library with dozens of false clones to confuse and disorient any who sought to interrupt his obsessive work. This blatant, blasphemous theft of the rite of kindling, however, did not go unnoticed by the strict religious authorities of the human world. The Way of White, the immense clerical institution founded to maintain the worship of the golden gods and control the massive undead populace, recognized the catastrophic danger of their sacred rite falling into the hands of a rogue, maddened necromancer. They quickly dispatched their very first, most legendary undead paladin on a wholly unyielding pilgrimage into the dark depths of the earth. This holy warrior, universally known as Paladin Leroy, clad in heavy, impenetrable golden armor and wielding a massive divine hammer, marched into the catacombs with the absolute directive to retrieve the stolen rite and return it to the church. Yet the suffocating, oppressive dark of the deep earth cares absolutely nothing for golden armor or holy mandates. Paladin Leroy pushed past the tragic illusions of Pinwheel, delving far too deep, moving past the catacombs and descending directly into the absolute blackness of the Tomb of the Giants. There, surrounded by the colossal, beastly skeletons that lurked in the pitch-black void. His holy mission ultimately failed. He succumbed to the encroaching, suffocating dark, his spirit violently twisting until he became a hostile, wandering phantom. He was doomed to forever guard the lightless domain of the slumbering Gravelord, mercilessly invading and crushing anyone who dared to approach Nito's ancient, silent sarcophagus. And so, the domain of death remained a fractured, profoundly tragic realm. The true god slumbered in apathetic isolation, reduced to a hollow battery for the fading era. A grieving father played God with stolen power in the crypts above, stitching flesh to bone in a futile defiance of loss. And all the while, the cursed human race continued to feed their precious souls to the roaring fires, trapped forever in a decaying world that violently refused to let them simply, peacefully die. By the time the cursed human race had multiplied, and the fading of the first flame had reached its most agonizing, desperate epic, the glorious world above the subterranean depths was little more than a crumbling, post-apocalyptic ruin. The grand, sprawling human kingdoms that had once flourished in the golden warmth of the sun were reduced to rotting, hollowed husks, their populations driven entirely mad by the relentless burning cycle of the dark sign. Yet the most profound and terrifying transformation did not occur in the muddy villages or the toxic swamps below. It occurred at the absolute pinnacle of the world. Anor Londo, the fabled celestial city of the gods, was completely and utterly abandoned. The exodus of the divine pantheon was not a glorious, organized retreat, but a quiet, cowardly flight born of absolute terror. When Lord Gwyn, the great Lord of Sunlight, recognized the inevitability of the dying flame, he had departed the city with half of his elite silver knights, descending into the ash-choked kiln to burn his own soul. With their absolute king gone and the radiant power of the sun noticeably faltering in the sky above, the remaining deities were gripped by an existential panic. They looked down from their pristine, towering marble spires and saw the shadows lengthening, the cold creeping in, and the desperate, immortal humans swarming the lands below. Unwilling to face the coming age of dark, the gods fled. They packed away their divine relics, abandoned their grand cathedrals, and quietly slipped away into obscured, forgotten realms, leaving the capital functionally, entirely empty. The once bustling courtyards, where legendary knights had sparred and golden deities had debated the laws of disparity, were reduced to echoing, freezing expanses of polished stone. The sweeping, intricate buttresses supported nothing but a hollow, silent sky. The biting autumnal wind whistled mournfully through the towering brass spires, carrying with it the undeniable scent of an era that had already died. However, hidden deep within the sprawling, empty architecture of this majestic ghost town, one single true deity remained in Anor Londo. This was Dark Sun Gwyndolin, the youngest child of the great Lord Gwyn. Gwyndolin's existence was a closely guarded, deeply shameful secret of the royal family. In a celestial kingdom entirely dedicated to the radiant, unyielding power of the sun and the perfection of the physical form, Gwendolyn was born as a profound, heretical anomaly. He possessed a powerful, innate affinity for moon magic, a soft, ethereal power that was deeply antithetical to his father's blinding sunlight. Furthermore, he was afflicted from birth with a grotesque, terrifying physical deformity. Instead of a normal lower body, he possessed a writhing serpentine mass of snakes that served as his legs. Because of this profound, embarrassing deviation from the divine standard, Gwyn was never allowed to walk proudly in the golden courtyards or stand upon the sunlit balconies. He was hidden away in the deepest, subterranean levels of the city, locked within the cold, incense-choked confines of the Dark Moon tomb. To further suppress his heretical lunar affinity, he was raised entirely as a daughter, forced into robes of delicate silk and a towering, ornate crown that completely obscured his eyes, a physical manifestation of the blinding neglect he suffered at the hands of his own family. Despite this profound parental neglect and his miserably hidden, isolated existence, Gwyn harbored a twisted, fanatical devotion to his father's vision of an eternal age of fire. Sitting alone in the dark, cold tomb, surrounded by the empty sarcophagi of a dead era, Gwyn realized that if the human populace below ever discovered that the gods had fled, and that Anor Londo was an empty ruin, mass panic and immediate, violent rebellion would instantly follow. The fragile, fading order of the world would completely shatter. To prevent this catastrophic truth from ever reaching the mortal world, Gwyn utilized his unparalleled supreme mastery of lunar sorcery to cast a massive, city-wide illusion over the entirety of Anor Londo. It was an act of magical, sustained concentration, so immense, so incredibly taxing, that it defined his entire existence. He wove a grand, sweeping deception that bathed the freezing, abandoned marble ruins in warm, radiant, and entirely fabricated sunlight. He created a fake, blinding sun in the sky, a perfect, glowing orb designed explicitly to hide the terrifying reality of the eternal, freezing twilight that had actually settled over the highest peak of the world. But a city cannot merely look beautiful, it must appear defended. Gwyn populated the grand cathedrals, the sweeping staircases, and the empty courtyards with countless, highly lethal phantoms. He conjured illusory, towering sentinels to stand perfectly still before the grand doors. He manifested legions of phantom silver knights to endlessly patrol the pristine hallways, their spectral armor clanking with a hollow manufacture. He even populated the sky with bat-winged demons, beasts of the lower realms, subjugated to carry out the illusion of a functioning, strictly monitored celestial border. The city became a flawless, beautiful, and utterly hollow stage play, an architectural corpse painted to look like a sleeping giant. The absolute masterpiece, the central manipulative pillar of this grand illusion, was placed deep within the highest chamber of the grand cathedral. There, Gwyn conjured a massive, radiant projection of his older sister, Princess Gwynevere. The true Gwynevere had actually fled the city long ago, alongside the other terrified deities, eventually marrying Flan, the god of flame, and abandoning her divine duties entirely. But the illusory Gwynevere was designed to be the perfect, comforting, and motherly figurehead of the pantheon. She was projected at a colossal scale, bathed in a soft, heavenly glow, her voice honeyed and deeply reassuring. She was strategically placed to serve as the ultimate reward for any miserable, battered human who managed to survive the grueling ascent to the city. When a weary traveler finally stepped into her chamber, she would speak with absolute divine authority. She would bestow upon them the sacred Lord Vessel and command them, through a seemingly indisputable divine mandate to succeed her father, Lord Gwyn, and link the fading fire. It was a perfect emotional trap, designed to make the suffering humans feel profoundly validated, cherished, and chosen by the very gods who were actually farming them for fuel. This elaborate, sickening deception was heavily enforced. Operating from the dark shadows of Gwyn's honorary tomb, beneath the grand spiral staircase, Gwyn secretly controlled the blades of the Dark Moon. This was a terrifying, secretive covenant of magical assassins tasked with a singular, ruthless directive. They were to hunt down and completely silence any heretics who dared to discover or reveal the truth. Should a perceptive traveler deduce this grand deception and strike out to attack the radiant illusion of the princess, the magical veil would instantly violently shatter. The fake sun would vanish, plunging Anor Londo into its true, dark, freezing, and desolate state, revealing the terrifying depths of the god's profound desperation and immediately triggering the wrath of the Dark Moon assassins. Gwyn's primary obsessive objective was the continuation of his father's agonizing Age of Fire. However, he could not achieve this massive undertaking alone from his hidden tomb. He required a charismatic, external agent to interface directly with the human world. To this end, Gwyn allied himself closely with the primordial serpent known as Kingseeker Frampt. Together, the neglected, deformed god and the ancient, manipulative serpent orchestrated the greatest, most devastating lie ever told to the human race, the prophecy of the chosen undead. The prophecy, as it was whispered into the ears of desperate, hollowing humans in the dark, dictated a glorious path of redemption. It claimed that a single, preordained chosen undead would escape the northern asylums, ring the two great bells of awakening, journey to Anor Londo to retrieve the Lord vessel from Princess Gwyn, and ultimately succeed Lord Gwyn to lift this agonizing curse of undeath from the world. It was a tale of heroism, sacrifice, and ultimate salvation. In terrifying reality, the prophecy was a highly orchestrated, cold, and calculated mechanism designed exclusively to manipulate incredibly powerful humans into sacrificing themselves. The gods did not want a savior. They desperately needed optimal kindling. The entire journey of the supposed chosen undead was a brutal, merciless filtration system. The horrific trials of the land of Lordran, the poison swamps, the roaming demons, the sprawling, trap-filled nightmare known as Sen's Fortress, with its swinging axes and treacherous serpent guards, were not merely unfortunate obstacles. They were a deliberate, brutal meat grinder, designed to test the resilience of the human soul. Countless thousands of undead were continuously thrown into this horrific gauntlet. The vast, overwhelming majority of them lost their willpower, succumbed to the agonizing pain, and hollowed out completely, their minds breaking against the unforgiving stone of the world. But the sheer, relentless friction of the journey ensured an incredibly dark, pragmatic result. Whoever possessed the sheer willpower, the unyielding resilience, and the combat prowess to actually survive the demons, conquer the fortress, see through or blindly accept the grand illusion of Anor Londo, and reach the ash-choked kiln of the first flame, would have naturally amassed a soul incredibly dense and powerful. The chosen undead was not a prophesied, unique messiah ordained by the cosmos. The title was nothing more than a label applied to the most resilient, powerful battery the gods could successfully farm. Gwyn and Frompt created a system where humanity actively, desperately fought for the perceived honor of burning themselves alive. The undead were manipulated by the comforting illusion of a fake sun, a fake princess, and a fake destiny, completely unaware that their ultimate reward for their unimaginable suffering was to serve as nothing more than glorified firewood to artificially extend the dying, empty era of the very gods who had cursed them in the first place. The grand, sweeping deception orchestrated by the hidden, deformed god and the ancient manipulating serpent required a vast, continent-spanning infrastructure to effectively capture, filter, and process the cursed human population. It was not enough to simply project a radiant illusion of a princess and blindly hope the strongest warriors would eventually arrive at the highest peaks. The gods needed a massive, inescapable net cast across the entire mortal world. This monumental task of subjugation and control fell to the deeply entrenched, immensely powerful human religious institution known as the Way of White. To the common, desperate humans living in the muddy, decaying kingdoms of the fading age, the Way of White appeared as a beacon of holy salvation, a rigid, highly structured order of heavy-armored clerics and golden paladins who offered comforting prayers to the fading sun and promised divine mercy. In terrifying reality, the Church was deeply, inextricably complicit in the systemic manipulation, corralling, and farming of their own species. Founded in the strict, unyielding nation of Thor Rolund by a towering, imposing figure known as All-Father Lloyd, the institution commanded absolute, terrifying authority over the spiritual and physical lives of mankind. Lloyd audaciously claimed the prestigious title of Lord Gwyn's own uncle, wrapping his harsh, uncompromising decrees in that unassailable mandate of celestial blood. Under his rigid and unforgiving command, the Way of White did not seek to cure the undead curse, but rather to weaponize it. They systematically and mercilessly hunted down the undead across all the flourishing human kingdoms. When the fiery, agonizing seal of the dark sign appeared upon a human's flesh, they were no longer treated as citizens, parents, or children. The Church immediately branded them as accursed heretics, dangerous, rotting abominations whose very existence threatened the holy, golden order of the world. The Way of White mobilized grand, sweeping inquisitions, dragging the cursed humans from their homes in the dead of night. They systematically corralled these wretched, terrified individuals and exiled them to the far, freezing north. There, isolated from the rest of civilization by towering, snow-capped mountains and freezing oceans, the Church constructed massive stone asylums. These northern asylums were not hospitals or sanctuaries. They were brutal, unforgiving prisons of cold iron and damp stone. The Church crammed the undead into tiny, lightless cells, leaving them to rot in absolute isolation. This systemic corralling created a desperate, heavily concentrated population of undead who were entirely stripped of their previous lives and left with nothing but the creeping, agonizing numbness of the hollowing process. It was within these freezing, hopeless asylums that the Way of White planted the insidious seeds of the gods' grand deception. The clerics fed the desperate, imprisoned undead the fabricated legend of the chosen undead, whispering through the iron bars that a singular, preordained champion would one day escape the asylum, ring the awakening bells, and journey to the realm of the gods to lift the curse. This beautifully crafted lie gave the prisoners a false, desperate sense of purpose, a tiny, glowing ember of hope in the suffocating dark. When an undead inevitably broke free from the northern ruins and began their agonizing pilgrimage toward the celestial city, they were unknowingly stepping directly into the gods' brutal filtration system, willingly throwing themselves into the meat grinder of the world in a desperate bid to fulfill a holy prophecy that was designed exclusively to harvest their souls. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming, continent-spanning oppression, not all humans were entirely blinded by the golden miracles and the holy chants of the clerics. A dangerous, secretive sect of humanity recognized the absolute tyranny of the gods, peering through the religious dogma to see the terrifying, cannibalistic reality of the undead curse. These disillusioned scholars, warriors, and heretics banded together in the shadows to instigate the occult rebellion. This was not a mindless, chaotic riot, but a highly organized, deeply philosophical uprising that sought to completely dismantle the divine hierarchy and punish the celestial beings for disrupting the natural flow of the universe. The rebels recognized that conventional steel and primitive magic were utterly useless against the blinding, surging power of the gods. To fight the divine, one needed a power fundamentally antithetical to the first flame. Therefore, the occult rebellion sought to steal the terrifying, suffocating power of Grave Lord Nito, the first of the dead. They sought to delve into the deepest, pitch-black crypts of the earth to claim the dark ember, a blasphemous, smoldering artifact of raw, concentrated dark energy. With this ember, the rebel blacksmiths aimed to forge occult weapons, armaments specifically, heavily infused with the heavy physical manifestation of the dark, designed explicitly to inflict massive, catastrophic damage upon divine beings, their loyal knights, and their golden kin. It is highly probable, according to the obscured, forbidden texts hidden from the church, that Velka, the rogue goddess of sin, was the true spiritual architect of this massive human rebellion. Velka was a terrifying, enigmatic figure who resided in the shadowy, sinister land of Ka-Rim. She was a deity, yet she possessed a deep, intrinsic connection to the dark and the emotional, raw power of humanity. As the goddess who oversaw the pardoning and punishment of sins, Velka operated entirely outside the rigid, luminous hierarchy of Lord Gwyn's capital. She viewed the first sin, the artificial extension of the Age of Fire and the creation of the Dark Sign, not as a noble sacrifice, but as the ultimate unforgivable crime against the natural order of the cosmos. She sought to punish her fellow gods for their hubris, silently guiding the human rebels, providing them with the dark miracles and the obscured knowledge necessary to challenge the celestial throne. Despite their terrifying armaments and the silent backen of a rogue goddess, the occult rebellion was ultimately brutally crushed by the overwhelming military might of the gods and the fanaticism of the Way of White. The rebellion's leaders were slaughtered in the dark, their movement violently disbanded before it could ever lay siege to the golden walls of the capital. The deeply feared Dark Ember was seized and hidden away by the church within the cold, painted confines of an isolated world, ensuring it could never again be used to forge god-killing steel. The rebels' most prominent artifact, the menacing effigy shield, was discarded and left to rot in the suffocating, lightless depths of the Tomb of the Giants, a tragic, forgotten monument to a failed uprising. However, the threat to the divine order did not solely emerge from the desperation of the human race. Deep, internal dissent brewed even among Lord Gwyn's closest, most trusted, and heavily armored allies. The most prominent and terrifying example of this internal fracturing, legendary warrior known as Bishop's Havel the Rock. Havel was a towering, unimaginably strong leader within the Way of White, a battlefield commander whose very name inspired terrified awe among his enemies and fierce, unbreakable loyalty among his men. He was the brilliant creator of the Great Magic Barrier Miracle, a defensive spell of such profound, resounding power that it completely nullified the arcane sorceries of his foes. He marched into battle encased entirely in armor carved from solid slabs of unyielding rock, and he wielded a colossal, petrified dragon tooth as a bludgeoning club, a weapon so impossibly heavy that only a warrior of his staggering might could even lift it from the earth. Despite his elevated position within the Holy Church and his long history of fighting alongside the Lord of Sunlight, Havel harbored a deep, violent, and completely unyielding hatred for Seath the Scaleless. Havel was a man of strict, uncompromising faith, and he viewed the pale, albino dragon not as a noble duke, but as a treacherous, repulsive abomination. To Havel, Seath's obsessive, maddening research into crystals and artificial immortality was the absolute height of heretic filth, a blasphemous perversion of the natural order that deeply offended his rigid sensibilities. He despised the fact that Lord Gwyn had elevated a traitorous beast to the noble ranks of the divine court, granting him a fragment of the Lord's soul and allowing his twisted sorceries to flourish in the archives adjacent to the holy city. Havel's disgust eventually metastasized into outright, dangerous treason. He was not a man to simply voice a quiet grievance. He was a warrior of action. Havel secretly gathered his own fiercely loyal apostles, knights clad in heavy stone, who shared his intense, burning hatred for the pale dragon and the corrupted sorceries of the divine court. The evidence strongly suggests that Havel the Rock actively plotted a violent coup against the gods. Deep within the labyrinthine, shadowy basement of a grand building in Ahnor Londo, hidden away amongst old statues and discarded relics, lay a secret stash containing Havel's legendary stone armor alongside a heavily infused occult club. The presence of this dark, god-killing weapon among the belongings of a supposedly holy bishop proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Havel intended to use the dark power of the rebellion to shatter the celestial pantheon and completely eradicate Seath the Scaleless. Before Havel could strike his catastrophic blow, his plot was discovered. To neutralize this massive internal threat, without sparking a full-blown civil war among the ranks of the church, Lord Gwyn, or perhaps his terrified loyalists acting in the dark, moved swiftly against the bishop. Havel was stripped of his command, dragged far away from the golden twilight of the capital, and locked away in a lonely, cylindrical watchtower situated at the very bottom of the Undead Burg. The heavy wooden door was magically sealed shut from the outside, trapping the legendary warrior in a tiny circular room of cold, unyielding stone. There, in the suffocating silence of the watchtower, Stripped of his holy purpose and betrayed by the very gods he had once sworn to serve, Havel the Rock was left to rot. The agonizing cycle of the dark sign slowly burned away his brilliant tactical mind and his towering righteous fury. The man who had once commanded legions and crafted miracles of absolute defense completely lost his sanity in the dark, deteriorating into a mindless, violent hollow. He paced the small, circular room for centuries, violently swinging his colossal dragon tooth at any unfortunate soul who dared to open the door, a tragic, hollowed monument to the absolute intolerance of the divine order. Deep within the obscured, convoluted flow of time in Lordran, some scholars whisper of even stranger, apocryphal theories regarding the ultimate fate of the rock-clad bishop. Some highly debated texts suggest that Havel, in his absolute desperation to defeat the magical might of Seath, utilized ancient forbidden rites to completely transcend his own humanity. These theories propose that Havel sought the ultimate, untouchable defense against magic, slowly transforming himself over countless centuries into the majestic, immortal stone dragon found resting eternally in the deep, subterranean waters of Ash Lake. While this remains fiercely debated and largely unproven among historians, the very existence of the theory underscores the profound, earth-shattering legend of a man whose hatred for the divine was so absolute that it drove him to embrace the dark, challenging the very foundations of the Golden Age before being swallowed entirely by the creeping, silent madness of isolation. While Havel the Rock was swallowed entirely by the creeping, silent madness of his isolated watchtower, a far more insidious and catastrophic madness was allowed to rot completely unchecked within the very shadow of the god's own capital. High upon the golden peaks of Anor Londo, looming directly adjacent to the grand cathedrals and the sweeping marble courtyards, stood a colossal, towering repository of knowledge known as the Duke's Archives. This labyrinthine structure of towering bookshelves and intricate, spiraling staircases was the grand estate gifted by Lord Gwyn to the great trader, Seath the Scaleless. However, as the centuries dragged on and the first flame began to fade, this vast library ceased to be a place of quiet, scholarly pursuit. Instead, within the cold, echoing halls of the Duke's Archives, Seath the Scaleless's obsessive, desperate fascination with the primordial crystal and his elusive, agonizing quest to achieve true immortality fractured his ancient mind completely. The albino dragon had betrayed his own immortal kin solely because he feared the fragile, vulnerable nature of his own pale, scaleless flesh. This paralyzing terror of death drove him to covet the eternal stasis of the stone he could never naturally possess. He hoarded the ancient, magical crystals within the highest, most inaccessible chambers of his library, studying their intricate facets and their cold, unyielding perfection. But the profound isolation, combined with the inherently erratic, unnatural energy pulsating from the stolen primordial crystal, broke his sanity. The once grand Duke's Archives transformed from a pristine monument of learning into a horrific, blood-soaked laboratory, a nightmare realm where the desperate dragon conducted unspeakable atrocities in the name of survival. Because his obsessive research had slowly rendered him completely blind, the massive pale dragon could no longer navigate the sprawling ruins of the world to procure the living subjects his twisted experiments required. To solve this, Seath employed a terrifying legion of sorcerers known as the Channelers. These imposing figures were clad in heavy brass armor and wielded long, jagged tridents that resonated with a sickening, magical hum. They wore distinctive, towering helmets adorned with 6 distinct eye holes. These multi-eyed channelers functioned as the literal eyes and the far-reaching, grasping hands for the blind dragon. They were dispatched from the high archives, scouring the decaying lower ruins of Lordran to mercilessly kidnap living, human test subjects, dragging the terrified victims back up the mountain to feed the dragon's insatiable, mad curiosity. The most abhorrent, unforgivable of these magical experiments did not target the hardened warriors or the hollowed soldiers of the decaying kingdoms. Seath's twisted mind developed a morbid, agonizing fascination with the divine essence of life, fertility, and biological resilience. Consequently, his most frequent and tragic victims were women, specifically the gentle weeping maidens who had once served the illusory Princess Guinevere, and the devoted, faithful clerics of the Way of White who had journeyed to the capital seeking holy salvation. These innocent women were dragged down into the lowest, darkest dungeon of the archives, a damp, freezing prison completely cut off from the golden twilight of the city above. Within this lightless, echoing oubliette, the captive women were subjected to agonizing, invasive crystal magic. Seath attempted to forcefully fuse the eternal, unyielding properties of the magical crystals directly into their soft, mortal flesh. The resulting mutations were a profound crime against nature. The beautiful, devout maidens were violently transformed into terrifying creatures known as pizakas. These were writhing, blue, serpentine abominations, grotesque slugs of mutated flesh with bulbous, horrifying heads and grasping tentacles. Stripped entirely of their humanity and their former beauty, yet retaining just enough of their fractured consciousness to comprehend their own horrifying state, the pizakas were left to aimlessly slither at the damp base of the archive's massive prison. They huddled together in the freezing dark, their tentacles entwined, emitting a constant heartbreaking chorus of soft, human weeping that echoed endlessly up the spiraling stone staircases. The gentle tears of the former clerics fell from the grotesque, blue faces of the monsters they had become, a chilling, eternal testament to the sheer cruelty of the mad dragon. It is a grim, historical irony that Seath's horrific bloody experiments with souls and crystals ultimately birthed the entire foundation of modern sorcery. The arcane knowledge forged in the agonized screams of the maidens was incredibly potent, drawing scholars from across the world like moths to a poisonous flame. The most legendary among these seekers was a human known as Big Hat Logan, a sorcerer of such profound intellect that his massive hat was designed specifically to block out the distracting noise of the world so he could focus entirely on his thoughts. Logan eventually followed in the exact, tragic footsteps of the albino dragon, traveling deep into the Duke's archives to uncover the absolute pinnacle of magical knowledge. He pored over the maddening texts and the crystallized research left behind by the blind beast. However, the sheer, unfathomable complexity of the crystal magic, combined with the inherent, corrupting madness woven into the spells, proved entirely too much for the mortal mind to bear. The legendary human sorcerer was eventually consumed by the exact same maddening knowledge, broken Seath. Big Hat Logan's mind shattered, causing him to strip down to his bare undergarments in a fit of absolute, shivering delirium, completely adopting the erratic, violent, and paranoid behaviors of the mad dragon he had sought to emulate. Seath the Scaleless's morbid, unyielding fascination with the concepts of fertility and reproduction eventually culminated in a creation far more terrifying to the divine pantheon than any weeping slug or mad sorcerer. Through a deeply obscured, horrifying union, it is heavily implied by the darkest, most forbidden texts that the albino dragon's experiments led directly to the conception of a tragic, utterly unique abomination known as crossbreed Priscilla. Priscilla was a towering, pale entity, possessing a tragically beautiful humanoid upper body, adorned with the soft, fluffy fur and the sweeping, powerful tail of a draconic beast. She was the ultimate blasphemy, the bastard child of a traitorous, scaleless dragon and an unknown, disgraced deity of the celestial pantheon. Her mere existence as a crossbreed made her a walking taboo, an absolute affront to the strict, perfect, and unyielding order that Lord Gwyn had established. But it was not her fluffy tail or her tragic lineage that truly terrified the golden gods of Anor Londo. Priscilla was born possessing an innate, occult power known as Life Hunt. This was an ability so incredibly potent, so inherently and completely antithetical to the very concept of all life, that it caused a profound, paralyzing terror among the immortal deities. The gods, who had hurled lightning to shatter the stone dragons and built a kingdom that spanned the heavens, realized that this gentle, tragic crossbreed possessed the raw, innate capacity to single-handedly slaughter the gods themselves. Fearing a being that could effortlessly dismantle their fragile, fading pantheon, the gods did not attempt to cure her, nor did they grant her a secluded tower in the capital. They treated her as the ultimate antithesis to their golden age and permanently banished her from the celestial city of Anor Londo. They sealed the young crossbreed away in a specialized metaphysical prison known as the Painted World of Ari Amis. This was not a dungeon of iron bars and stone walls, but a cold, isolated pocket dimension hidden entirely within the fibers of a massive, sweeping canvas. The painting itself was hung in absolute secrecy within the lower, shadowed halls of the great cathedral, completely guarded and obscured from the prying eyes of the human populace. The Painted World was a permanent freezing exile, a realm accessible only by possessing a peculiar, discarded doll that served as the sole, magical key to pierce the veil of the canvas. To ensure that the crossbreed could never escape, and to prevent any curious wanderer from accidentally unleashing her terrifying power upon the world, the gods employed a secretive sect known as the Painting Guardians. These lithe, agile warriors were clad in flowing garments of alabaster, a form of soft gypsum, and they guarded the massive canvas fiercely, attacking any who approached in circular, mesmerizing, and deadly dancing motions, even though the original historical reason for their eternal vigil had been entirely lost to their own memories over the passing centuries. The Painted World of Aria Miss was a bleak, freezing landscape. It was a world entirely blanketed in deep, unmelting snow, featuring a crumbling, wrought-wood bridge and a towering central fortress that offered absolutely no warmth. Because it was completely disconnected from the fading first flame and the natural flow of time, the dimension served as a physical and metaphysical dumping ground for objects, individuals, and truths that the gods deemed taboo, sinful, or threatening to their fragile, perfect order. It was a cold prison for the Pantheon's greatest mistakes. Yet despite her horrifying treatment by the outside world, and despite being locked away in a freezing, desolate dimension, simply for the crime of being born, crossbreed Priscilla harbored absolutely no malice toward her divine captors. Standing alone in the highest snow-covered tower of the ruined fortress, she did not plot revenge, nor did she seek to unleash her terrifying life-hunt power upon the world that had rejected her. Instead, the tragic crossbreed became a peaceful, benevolent warden over the other outcasts who had been violently thrown into the canvas alongside her. The painted world became a bizarre, desperate asylum. It was populated by those who had nowhere else to go, miserable sinners fleeing the wrath of the church, grotesque, mutated harpies born of human sin, infected, bloated undead suffering from toxic ailments, and desperate followers of the occult who sought refuge from the sweeping inquisitions of the Way of White. Priscilla watched over all of these wretched, broken castaways with a gentle, forgiving grace. She viewed the freezing, isolated pocket dimension not as a cruel punishment, but as a genuine, peaceful sanctuary for the unwanted. She described the cold, snowy world as entirely peaceful, and she sincerely believed its grotesque, violent inhabitants to be kind, for they were simply misunderstood, frightened souls seeking a place to exist away from the cruel, burning cycle of the dark sign. When a rare, lost wanderer managed to pierce the canvas and approach her snowy tower, Priscilla remained entirely non-hostile unless directly provoked with violence. She would gently, softly advise the wanderer to turn back, to jump from the wooden plank at the edge of the fortress and return to their own world, emphasizing the tragic, heartbreaking reality that the gods' ultimate freezing prison had genuinely become the only true sanctuary for those who had been broken by the fading of the fire. The crushing weight of the fading age was not merely felt in the grand halls of Agnor Londo or the blood-stained laboratories of the Duke's archives. Its true, agonizing toll was most acutely experienced by the individual souls who wandered the ruined, ash-choked landscape. The tragedy of Lordran was a tapestry woven from the broken lives of the undead, and nowhere was the psychological erosion of the curse more heart-wrenchingly displayed than in the stories of the pilgrims who sought meaning in a world that had long ago discarded the concept. Two figures, in particular, serve as the most haunting monuments to the futility of human ambition against the encroaching dark. Solaire of Astora was a man defined by a fiercely optimistic, almost blinding faith. Unlike the many desperate, cynical undead who roamed the ruins, Solaire remained an unwavering beacon of warmth, driven by a deeply personal, obsessive quest to find his very own sun. To Solaire, the sun was not merely the golden orb that hung in the sky. It was a profound, burning metaphor for purpose, validation, and a divine connection that could pierce the suffocating gray fog of his existence. While other cursed beings sought power through the forbidden arts of the occult or the cold calculations of sorcery, Solaire relied purely on his own grueling physical training, his unwavering faith, and his immense, raw courage. He was a warrior of sunlight, who embraced the philosophy of jolly cooperation, offering his golden sign to aid other struggling undead through their darkest, most lethal trials, hoping that by kindling the spirits of others, he might finally illuminate his own path. His quest, however, was a slow descent into a reality that offered no light. As he journeyed deeper into the heart of Lordran, descending past the illusory sun of Anor Londo, and venturing into the subterranean, demon-infested ruins of Lost Izalith, his relentless optimism began to fracture. Lost Izalith was a place of eternal, chaotic fire, where the air itself screamed with the agony of the ancient, mutated flame, and where the demons of the past patrolled the molten, ruinous halls. Plunging into the dark without ever finding the brilliant, guiding incandescence he sought, Solaire's mental state began to deteriorate into a profound, hollowed depression. In his most desperate, vulnerable moment, he stumbled upon a sunlight maggot, a glowing, parasitic insect that thrived in the chaotic depths. Delirious and seeking any sign of his god, Solaire donned the parasite upon his skull. The maggot emitted a blinding, artificial light, tricking the broken knight into believing he had finally, truly found his son. The parasite, however, was a cruel, feeding horror. It shattered his remaining sanity, turning Solaire into a rabid, mindless beast that would attack anyone who approached him. The player was then forced to strike down the very companion who had been their most steadfast, hopeful friend, a heartbreaking confrontation that served as the ultimate proof that in Lordran, even the purest faith was destined to be consumed by the dark. In stark, tragic contrast stood Siegmeyer of Katarina, a knight who presented the paradox of the proud, jovial adventurer. Clad in his distinctive, bulbous, onion-shaped armor, Siegmeyer was a man of immense spirit, forever fascinated by the mysteries and the insurmountable obstacles of the crumbling world. He traveled with a buoyant, infectious bravado, always eager to confront the horrors of Lordran with a hearty laugh and a stout blade. Yet Siegmeyer was remarkably, painfully inept. He was repeatedly trapped by environmental puzzles, besieged by enemies he could not hope to overcome, and left entirely helpless by the sheer, crushing scale of the world's decay. Every time the player intervened to rescue Siegmeyer at the precarious ledge of Sen's fortress, in the treacherous heights of Anor Londo, or amidst the poisonous, suffocating mire of Blighttown, it chipped away at his knightly pride. The core, terrifying mechanic of the undead curse was the maintenance of a singular, driving purpose. The moment that purpose was undermined, the mind would inevitably collapse. Siegmeyer's entire identity was anchored to the role of a heroic, self-sufficient adventurer who braved the world on his own terms. By constantly, albeit kindly, stepping in to solve his problems and save his life, the player inadvertently stripped the knight of his agency and his dignity. This psychological degradation reached its bleak conclusion in the primordial silence of Ash Lake. His daughter, Sieg Lin Du, a rare, mortal human who had braved the absolute horrors of Lordran solely to deliver her mother's dying words, eventually caught up to him. She found him fully hollowed, his spirit completely broken by his reliance on the player's intervention and his inability to find a warrior's end. Sieglinde was forced to strike down her own father, weeping over the corpse of a man whose pride and noble spirit had been eroded bit by bit by the world's refusal to let him succeed or fail on his own merits. These tragedies were not isolated occurrences. They were the inevitable outcomes of a world designed to break the human spirit. The crestfallen warrior, who sat mere steps from the bonfire at Firelink Shrine, represented the ultimate, cynical surrender to this reality. He mocked the prophecy of the chosen undead, dismissed the player's grand ambitions as the delirious ravings of a fool, and refused to move, choosing to sit in the damp, rotting air of the hub rather than participate in a cycle he knew was inherently corrupt. He recognized the sheer, exhausting futility of the world's state and chose instead the slow, static stagnation of inaction. When the primordial serpent Frampt eventually arrived at Firelink, his foul, putrid stench and his loud, vibrating snoring shattered the warrior's fragile, cynical peace. Forced to leave his comfortable sanctuary by the encroaching pressure of the divine puppets, the crestfallen warrior attempted to find some form of solace or purpose in the haunted, flooded ruins of New Lundo. However, the oppressive, heavy atmosphere and the untouchable wailing ghosts of the drowned city completely shattered his remaining sanity. He hollowed entirely, turning hostile toward the player, an embodiment of a soul that had simply refused to fight, and in doing so, had been consumed by the very darkness he had claimed to understand. Even more disturbing than these broken spirits was the psychopathic devotion of Knight Lautrec of Kharim. Clad in the embraced armor of favor, Lautrec was a zealot, utterly devoted to the goddess Fina, whose armor was sculpted to wrap around him in a protective, possessive embrace. His devotion did not manifest as warmth or cooperation, but as a jealous, unyielding, and bloody possessiveness. Lautrec viewed firekeepers, the silent, suffering women bound to the bonfires, their bodies swarming with the writhing, dense humanity they harvested for the gods, as prime targets for his fanatical agenda. Upon escaping his imprisonment in the undead parish, Lautrec murdered Anastasia of Astora, the mute, crippled firekeeper of Firelink Shrine, plunging the hub area into a permanent, chilling darkness. Anastasia's own backstory was a grim, brutal testament to the cruelty of the Way of White. Her tongue had been cruelly cut out and her legs shattered by the church, ensuring she could never speak a god's name in vain and could never, ever abandon her eternal, agonizing post at the bonfire. Lautrec harvested her tremendously powerful firekeeper soul, likely as a macabre, blasphemous offering to Fina. The player was ultimately forced to use the Black Eye Orb to invade Lautrec's world in the hallowed halls of Anor Londo, executing him and his accomplices in a violent, bloody climax to reclaim the soul and restore the firekeeper's tortured, lingering life. A victory that felt less like salvation and more like a return to an endless, agonizing cycle. The complexity of these individual tragedies even extended into the apocryphal, divergent paths of history. Oscar of Astora, the noble, hallowed knight who first rescued the player from the Northern Asylum, became a symbol of the tragedy of failed purpose. In the common retelling, he imparts the legend of the chosen undead, gives the player the Estus flask, and dies, his mission unfulfilled. Yet in the convoluted, fractured flow of time that characterized Lordran, there existed legendary accounts of a timeline where Oscar survived the asylum. In this alternate thread, Oscar journeyed alongside the player, offering tactical assistance in the Darkroot Garden and the frozen halls of Anor Londo. Ultimately, however, the brutal, binary nature of the world's choice to link the fire or embrace the dark forced an irreparable wedge between them. When the player aligned themselves with one primordial serpent, Oscar invariably chose to serve the other. The two who had once stood together in the asylum were forced into a tragic, climactic duel at the end of the world to determine the true monarch, a conflict that served as a final reminder that in the world of Lordran, there was no room for true companionship, only for the cold, unyielding necessity of the cycle. The long, treacherous pilgrimage through the decaying heart of Lordran concludes not with a triumphant fanfare or the glorious restorations of a kingdom, but with a descent into the final, ash-choked remnants of existence. The journey ends at the kiln of the first flame, a place where the concepts of time, space, and causality have utterly collapsed under the weight of an agonizing artificial stasis. To reach this final, desolate sanctum is to witness the absolute nadir of the divine order, a landscape of melted stone, petrified pillars, and a thick, suffocating blanket of gray ash that has accumulated over thousands of years of burning desperation. It is here, in the shadow of the dying first flame, that the fate of the world is decided by the manipulation of ancient, inscrutable entities, and where the chosen undead must confront the fundamental deception that has fueled the age. The path to the kiln is guarded by the machinations of the primordial serpents, those ancient, toothy beings that existed in the lightless void long before the Edge of Fire was ever ignited by the discovery of the Lord's souls. They are not beings of light, nor are they beings of the dark. They are relics of the Age of Ancients, imperfect, formless dragons that view the current cosmological struggle between fire and dark as a grand, intellectual game to be played at the expense of all mortal life. The two primary architects of this manipulative scheme, Kingseeker Frampt and Darkstalker Kath, embody two diametrically opposed, yet equally self-serving ideologies that seek to steer the power vacuum left by the absent gods. Kingseeker Frampt, the serpent who initially presented himself as the noble ancient guide to the chosen undead, represents the absolute, unyielding continuation of the status quo. By positioning himself as a loyal servant of the late Lord Gwyn and the established divine order, Frampt frames the final, harrowing decision as a path of noble, heroic sacrifice. He urges the chosen undead to collect the scattered Lord souls, fill the Lord vessel, and proceed to the kiln to succeed the hallowed Lord of Cinder. For Frampt, the Age of Fire is the only acceptable reality, and he manipulates the player into believing that linking the fire will lift the undead curse, banish the eternal twilight, and restore the glory of the celestial pantheon. It is a narrative of redemption and heroic purpose, a comforting lie that convinces the player that their suffering, their many deaths, and the sacrifices they have made throughout their pilgrimage were all for the sake of a higher, divine salvation. In stark, chilling contrast stands Darkstalker Kath, the serpent who dwells in the suffocating, lightless depths of the abyss. Kath does not speak of nobility or divine restoration. He speaks of secrets, hidden histories, and the inevitable rise of humanity. He reveals the suppressed history of the furtive pygmy and the unique, infinite nature of the dark soul, framing the Age of Fire as an unnatural parasitic era that has forcibly shackled the human race for countless agonizing millennia. Kath urges the chosen undead to reject the god's grand deception, strike down the Lord of Cinder, and simply walk away from the flame. He promises that by letting the fire die, the player will assume their rightful place as the Dark Lord, ushering in the Age of Man and liberating humanity from the burning tyranny of the gods. Yet, a meticulous, dispassionate analysis of the cosmological mechanics reveals that both ideologies are founded upon a catastrophic, fundamental misinterpretation of the world state. The primordial serpents, as relics of the primordial epoch, are ultimately entirely foreign to the current, disparate paradigm of fire and dark. Evidence, such as the iconography found in various parts of Lordran, suggests that their apparent hostile rivalry may be a meticulously crafted illusion of choice, or perhaps they are literally two heads of the exact same subterranean ancient entity. Whether the player chooses to link the fire or walk away, both Frampt and Kath appear in unison at the end of the journey, bowing to the victor with equal opportunistic servility. They do not care which path is chosen. They only require that the current dominant powers, the lords who originally ended the Age of Ancients, are systematically eliminated by the player. Their true, long-term objective is likely the gradual, systemic degradation of the first flame through repeated weakened linkings, or the uncontrolled apocalyptic proliferation of the abyss, both of which erode the disparity that ended their eternal era, slowly reverting the world to a gray, lifeless state. The final confrontation at the kiln of the first flame is the grim culmination of this cycle. The chosen undead must face the Lord of Cinder, the hollowed, mindless, and agonizingly powerful husk of Lord Gwyn himself. Gwyn, the once glorious Lord of Sunlight, who hurled lightning to shatter the eternal dragons, is now nothing more than a charred, flaming sentinel violently guarding the fire he sacrificed his soul to sustain. He is a tragic monument to the first sin, a being who destroyed his own sanity and humanity to artificially extend an era that had already naturally expired. To slay him is to perform a mercy, yet it is also the final step in the complete, systematic eradication of the old gods. When the chosen undead finally stands before the dying, flickering embers, the choice they are forced to make is, in truth, an illusion. To link the fire is to perpetuate the cycle, to artificially extend the age of fire for a short, fleeting duration, and to trap the next generation of humans in the exact same cycle of suffering, hollowing, and eventual sacrifice. It is a noble gesture, but one that is fundamentally futile, as the flame will inevitably fade again, requiring yet another sacrifice in a stagnant, agonizing loop of eternal repetition. It is the ultimate, selfless act of maintaining a lie, ensuring that the god's grand deception continues to feed upon the souls of humanity until there is nothing left to burn. Conversely, to reject the flame and embrace the dark is to unleash the untamed, monstrous potential of the abyss. While Kath frames this as the Age of Man, the historical evidence provides a much more terrifying reality, as demonstrated by the horrific, apocalyptic mutations of Ulasil and the genocidal drowning of the thriving metropolis of New Lundo. The abyss is not a gentle, liberatory force. It is a volatile, chaotic, and infectious void that swallows identity, reason, and physical form, transforming sentient beings into bloated, ravenous monstrosities. The Age of Dark would not be an age of human rule. It would be a chaotic, fragmented nightmare where the unchecked abyssal hunger of the dark soul would consume the world from within, leading to a state of existence far more terrifying than the cold, fading light of the fire. Lordran is a universe fundamentally trapped between two catastrophic failures. To cling to the light is to defy the natural laws of the cosmos, resulting in the systemic, forced cannibalization of the human soul and the prolonged stagnation of the world. To embrace the dark is to unleash the untamed, cancerous potential of the abyss, which destroys all that it touches. The lore of Lordran is not a narrative of heroic triumph, nor is it a simple tragedy. It is a profound, mythological analysis of the terror of mortality, the inevitable, rot-inducing corruption of absolute power, and the inescapable, crushing burden of choice in a world that is, by every metric, already dead. The cycle is absolute. The fire rises, burns brightly, begins to fade, and then must be either violently stoked or allowed to die, each choice leading to its own unique, horrific end. The chosen undead is not a savior, but a tool. The lords are not deities, but broken husks clinging to a past that can never be reclaimed. And the primordial serpents are the ancient, patient observers, waiting for the world to return to the gray, silent emptiness from which it was born. The history of Lordran is a closed circle, an eternal repeating narrative of suffering where the only true, defining characteristic of existence is the struggle itself. As the chosen undead stands before the final, dying embers, they do not face a grand, meaningful decision. They face the final, crushing realization that every path leads to the same inevitable, hollow end. There is no victory to be claimed, no glorious future to be built, and no hope to be found in the ashes. There is only the long, cold wait for the next cycle, the next sacrifice, and the next flicker of fire in a world that has already lost its meaning. But remember, the flames will always fade, and the dark will always return, only for embers to dance once more in the ash. We shall explore the cursed cycles of Drangleic and Lothric in our future tales. Until then, good night, chosen undead. Whatever horrors tomorrow may bring, rest now, for you have not gone hollow today. May the flames guide your dreams.